In the year 1309, high in the Welsh borderlands where morning mist clung to ancient hills, a stonemason named Osric tended the walls of a small monastery, his work-weathered hands moving with the same patient rhythm they had known for 40 years. Welcome to this peaceful hour of night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to this remote Welsh monastery, following Osric through his daily craft of maintaining the sacred stones. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. The September dawn arrived slowly, spreading amber light across the cloister walls. Osric, 63 years old, stood in the workshop courtyard, his work-weathered hands resting on the smooth surface of a limestone block. The stone felt cool beneath his palms, still holding the night's chill despite the gentle warmth beginning to touch the eastern wall. His graying red hair, more silver now than copper, caught the early light as he bent to examine the block's surface, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The scent of damp earth rose from the garden beyond the workshop, mixing with the familiar smell of stone dust that clung to his leather apron. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang for prime, its sound drifting across the valley like a question asked of the morning air. Osric hummed plain chant melodies while working, the same low tones he had learned as a boy, the notes barely audible but constant, a thread of sound that seemed to steady his hands. He had been the monastery's stone keeper for nearly 4 decades. The title meant he maintained every wall, every column, every threshold that supported the brothers' daily prayers. When a stone cracked from frost, when mortar crumbled from age, when a step wore hollow from countless footfalls, Osric would arrive with his tools and his patience, making the damage whole again. His craft asked nothing more than attention, and he gave it freely, without urgency or complaint. By mid-morning, he had gathered his tools, a wooden mallet smooth from decades of use, 3 chisels of varying widths, a leather pouch of lime mortar he had mixed the previous afternoon. The mortar gave off a faint alkaline scent, sharp but not unpleasant, familiar as bread or wood smoke. Osric lifted the pouch carefully, feeling its weight settle against his hip, and made his way through the cloister toward the chapter house, where Brother Anselm had reported a crack in the eastern wall. The walk took him past the herb garden. Rosemary grew in thick clumps along the path, releasing its piney fragrance when his sleeve brushed against the leaves. The air here felt softer somehow, sheltered by the surrounding walls, warmed by the climbing sun. Osric paused to observe a bee moving from one lavender spike to another, its path unhurried, purposeful. He smiled slightly, recognizing something of his own rhythm in the creature's steady progress. When he reached the chapter house, the damage revealed itself as Brother Anselm had described: a hairline fracture running vertically through one of the stone blocks, perhaps 6 inches long, thin as a blade of grass. Frost had worked its way into some small flaw during the previous winter, and time had done the rest. Osric set down his tools and ran his fingers along the crack, feeling the slight roughness where the stone had separated. The texture told him what he needed to know. This would require cleaning, filling, smoothing. Simple work, but work that deserved his full attention. He knelt on the flagstones, arranging his tools within easy reach. The worn surface beneath his knees felt comfortable, familiar. Osric, 63 years old, had knelt in this same posture thousands of times before thousands of stones, each one different, each one asking for the same careful presence. His work-weathered hands selected the narrowest chisel, and he began to clean the crack, removing loose fragments, preparing the stone to receive the mortar. The morning passed in a rhythm of small movements. Tap the chisel gently, brush away the dust, examine the surface, tap again. Sunlight moved across the chapter house floor, shifting from one flagstone to the next, marking time without urgency. The scent of lime mortar filled the air when Osric opened his pouch, earthy and mineral, a smell that had followed him through 4 decades of work. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, the sound barely rising above the gentle scrape of metal on stone. Brother Anselm appeared in the doorway, his own elderly frame silhouetted against the brightness outside. He said nothing, only watched for a moment before nodding and continuing on his way. There was no need for words. Osric's presence here, his tools spread carefully on the floor, his hands moving with their characteristic steadiness, all of this spoke its own language, one the brothers had learned to read long ago. By the time the crack had been cleaned and prepared, the sun stood directly overhead, pouring light through the high windows of the chapter house. Osric straightened slowly, feeling his joints adjust to the change in position, and walked to the courtyard fountain to wash the stone dust from his hands. The water ran cold and clear over his fingers, soothing, and he cupped his palms to drink, tasting the mineral sweetness that came from the spring feeding the monastery's supply. He returned to his workshop to retrieve fresh water for mixing. The workshop occupied a small stone building near the southern wall, its interior cool even in summer, dim even at midday. Tools hung on wooden pegs, hammers, levels, plumb lines, each in its designated place. Osric had organized this space when he first arrived as a young apprentice, and nothing had changed its arrangement in all the years since. The constancy pleased him, this sense that each tool would always rest exactly where his hand expected to find it. After mixing a small batch of mortar to the proper consistency, neither too wet nor too dry, he returned to the chapter house. The filling required a delicate touch, pressing the mortar into the crack without forcing it, allowing the material to find its own way into the smallest crevices. Osric worked with the edge of his smallest trowel, smoothing, checking, smoothing again. His graying red hair fell forward across his forehead, and he brushed it back absently, leaving a faint smudge of lime on his temple. The repair would need to cure overnight. Tomorrow he would return to smooth any unevenness, to match the filled crack as closely as possible to the surrounding stone. But for now, the work was complete. Osric cleaned his tools methodically, wiping each one with a rag dampened in water, drying them before returning them to his leather satchel. The ritual of cleaning felt as important as the repair itself, this honoring of the implements that served him faithfully, day after day, year after year. Afternoon light slanted through the cloister as he made his way toward the refectory. The brothers would be gathering soon for the midday meal, and though Osric maintained his own small cottage just beyond the monastery walls, he often joined them, accepting the simple food and the quiet companionship without ceremony. Today's meal would be bread, cheese, and a pottage of barley and root vegetables, the same fare the monastery had served for generations, nourishing without extravagance. He entered the refectory to find several brothers already seated at the long wooden tables. Brother Godfrey, the youngest of the community at perhaps 25 years old, looked up and smiled, gesturing to the empty space beside him. Osric settled onto the bench, feeling the smooth wood worn hollow by countless meals, and waited while Brother Thomas, the reader, began the customary passage from Scripture. The words washed over the room like water, their meaning less important than their rhythm, the way they shaped the silence into something communal and shared. When the reading ended, the brothers began to eat. Osric broke his bread slowly, savoring the yeasty interior, still slightly warm from the oven. The cheese had been aged through summer, its flavor sharp and clean, and the pottage carried the earthy sweetness of turnips and carrots cooked until tender. He ate without hurry, aware of the quiet sounds around him, the soft scrape of wooden spoons against bowls, the occasional clearing of a throat, the rustle of wool robes when someone shifted position. Brother Godfrey leaned close and spoke in a low voice, mindful of the refectory's customary silence. He mentioned that the garden wall, the low barrier separating the vegetables from the orchard, had developed a wobble in one section. Perhaps 3 or 4 stones had loosened over time. Nothing urgent, but something Osric might examine when his current tasks allowed. Osric nodded, filing the information away, already imagining the work removing the loose stones, checking the foundation, resetting everything level and true. After the meal, he walked through the monastery grounds, moving toward the garden wall to assess the damage Brother Godfrey had described. The afternoon had grown warm, pleasant without being heavy, and a light breeze carried the scent of ripening apples from the orchard. Osric, 63 years old, crossed the courtyard with his characteristic unhurried gait, his work-weathered hands swinging loosely at his sides. His graying red hair lifted slightly in the breeze, and he felt the warmth of sunlight on his shoulders, seeping through the linen of his tunic. The garden wall stood about waist-high, constructed of local fieldstone gathered from the surrounding hills. Osric found the wobbling section easily 4 stones in a row that shifted when he pressed against them, their mortar long since crumbled to powder. He knelt beside the wall, running his fingers along the joints, feeling where time and weather had done their patient work. The repair would take perhaps half a day, maybe less. He would return tomorrow with his tools after checking on the chapter house crack. For now, he simply rested his palm on the sun-warmed stone, feeling its solidity, its weight, its willingness to stay exactly where human hands had placed it, asking only for occasional care to remain useful. The stones spoke to him, had always spoken to him, though not in words. They communicated through texture, through temperature, through the way they settled under pressure or rang when struck with a mallet. Osric had learned their language slowly, over decades, and he trusted it more than he trusted human speech. He rose and continued his walk, following the wall's perimeter toward the orchard. The apple trees grew in neat rows, their branches heavy with fruit not quite ready for harvest. Another few weeks and the brothers would spend several days gathering the crop, pressing some for cider, storing the rest in the cool cellar beneath the kitchen. Osric had built that cellar's stone shelving 20 years ago, carving niches into the walls to hold the wicker baskets that cradled the apples through winter. A thrush sang from somewhere in the branches above him, its liquid notes tumbling over each other in seemingly random patterns that nevertheless held their own logic, their own beauty. Osric paused to listen, his head tilted back, watching the play of light and shadow through the leaves. The dappled pattern shifted constantly, responding to the breeze, and he found himself following one particular patch of sunlight as it moved across the grass, a slow drift from west to east. By the time the bells rang for vespers, Osric had completed his circuit of the monastery grounds, noting several other minor repairs that would eventually require attention: a loose threshold stone in the library doorway, some weathered mortar in the north wall of the church, a cracked paving stone near the well. None of these demanded immediate action. They simply represented the ongoing conversation between human craft and natural decay, a dialogue Osric had been mediating for most of his adult life. He made his way to the small church for evening prayer. Though not a brother himself, Osric attended the services when his work allowed, finding comfort in the familiar progression of psalms and chants, the way the community's voices blended into something larger than their individual tones. He stood near the back, his hands folded loosely in front of him, and let the Latin phrases wash over him like rain, not struggling to understand every word, simply receiving the sound and the intention behind it. The church interior glowed with candlelight, dozens of small flames creating a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Shadows gathered in the corners and high along the vaulted ceiling, soft and unthreatening, while the carved stone columns caught the light on their rounded surfaces. Osric had repaired 3 of those columns over the years, replacing damaged sections, matching new stone to old with such care that even he sometimes struggled to identify the joins. The work pleased him still, this evidence of skill deployed in service of something lasting, something that would stand long after his hands had forgotten their strength. When the service ended, he walked back to his cottage as dusk gathered across the valley. The path wound through a small grove of beech trees, their leaves rustling overhead with a sound like distant water. His cottage sat at the edge of the monastery property, a modest structure of stone and timber that he had built himself during his first years as the monastery's keeper. One room served for sleeping, cooking, and the few domestic tasks his solitary life required. A second, smaller room held his personal tools and supplies, separate from the monastery's workshop. Inside, he lit a rushlight and set water to heat over the small hearth. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the familiar scent of tallow smoke filled the space, mixing with the lingering smell of stone dust that never quite left his clothing or his hair. Osric removed his leather apron and hung it on its peg, then washed his face and hands in a basin of cool water drawn from the well that morning. His evening meal consisted of bread left from the midday gathering, a small wedge of hard cheese, and an apple picked from one of the monastery trees. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the silence surrounding him, comfortable with it. Osric had never been a man of many words, had never felt the lack of conversation as a deprivation. His work spoke for him, and the stones he tended provided all the companionship he required. After eating, he sat on the wooden stool near his hearth and examined his hands in the flickering light. The work-weathered skin showed every year of his craft calluses along the palms, old scars from careless chisel slips, enlarged knuckles from decades of gripping tools. These hands had placed thousands of stones, had mixed countless batches of mortar, had shaped and smoothed and leveled more surfaces than he could possibly count. Yet they remained steady, reliable, capable of the precision his work demanded. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythm. Wake with the dawn, assess the day's tasks, move through them with patience and attention, return to this cottage when evening arrived. The pattern pleased him, this repetition that was never quite identical, each day presenting its own small variations within the larger constancy. Osric, 63 years old, had found his place in the world early and had never wished to leave it. The monastery grounds had become his universe, and within that limited geography, he had discovered an inexhaustible richness of stone and mortar, light and shadow, seasons turning through their ancient progressions. He extinguished the rushlight and lay down on his narrow bed, pulling a wool blanket over his shoulders. Through the small window, he could see a handful of stars beginning to emerge as full darkness settled over the valley. Their light reached him across distances he couldn't begin to imagine, and yet they seemed personal somehow, companionable, like the stones he worked with day after day, both near and impossibly far, both simple and infinitely complex. Sleep came easily, as it always did after a day of honest work. His breathing deepened, his body relaxed into the mattress of straw and wool, and consciousness faded gently into the same darkness that held the valley, the monastery, and all the stones he had ever touched. Morning returned with the same gradual brightening, pale light spreading across the workshop courtyard where Osric stood mixing fresh mortar. The limestone powder felt fine as flour between his fingers as he added water slowly, watching the mixture achieve the proper consistency, thick enough to hold its shape, loose enough to work into narrow spaces. The September air carried a coolness that spoke of autumn's approach, and he paused to breathe it in, letting the crispness settle in his lungs. His first task would be returning to the chapter house, checking yesterday's repair. The mortar needed a full day to cure properly, and now he would smooth any roughness, blend the patch as seamlessly as possible into the surrounding stone. Osric gathered his tools, a fine-grained whetstone for final smoothing, a soft cloth dampened with water, the smallest of his trowels. Each item fit into his leather satchel with the ease of long familiarity, and he slung the bag over his shoulder, feeling its comfortable weight settle against his hip. The walk to the chapter house took him through the cloister once more. Brother Anselm knelt in the garden, pulling weeds from between the herb beds, his movements slow and methodical. The elderly monk looked up and raised one hand in greeting, and Osric nodded in return, this silent exchange conveying all that needed saying between them. The rosemary plants released their fragrance as he passed, and somewhere nearby, a wood pigeon called its gentle, repetitive song. Inside the chapter house, yesterday's repair had set perfectly. Osric ran his work-weathered hands along the crack, feeling where the new mortar met the old stone, detecting the faintest ridge that his fingers identified even though his eyes might have missed it. He dampened his cloth and began to smooth the surface, using circular motions, applying pressure gradually, letting the wet stone yield to his touch. The work required no thought, only presence, and he hummed plain chant melodies while working, the low tones blending with the sounds of water on stone. Sunlight moved through the high windows, creating pools of brightness on the flagstone floor. Dust motes drifted through these illuminated spaces, rising and falling on air currents too subtle to feel, and Osric found himself pausing to watch their lazy dance. Time seemed to slow in moments like these, stretching out until minutes felt longer than hours, as though the present moment had depth and texture beyond its simple duration. When the repair satisfied his critical eye, smooth, level, matched to the surrounding surface, he cleaned his tools and gathered his satchel. The garden wall awaited his attention, those 4 loose stones that Brother Godfrey had mentioned. Osric made his way through the monastery grounds, noting how the morning had warmed, how the breeze had shifted to come from the south, carrying hints of the harvested fields beyond the valley. At the garden wall, he set down his tools and began the careful work of removing the loose stones. Each one required patience, rocking it gently to loosen the remaining mortar, lifting it clear without disturbing the neighboring stones, setting it aside on the grass. His graying red hair fell forward across his forehead as he bent to his task, and the sun warmed his shoulders through his linen tunic. The work felt good, this engagement of muscle and attention, this dialogue between his hands and the stubborn weight of stone. Brother Thomas approached from the orchard, carrying a basket of windfall apples destined for the kitchen. The elderly monk, perhaps 70 years old, moved with the stiffness of age but maintained his customary dignity. He paused to watch Osric work, then spoke in his quiet, measured way. The wall had served the monastery for generations, he observed, but even the finest craft required renewal over time. Nothing built by human hands lasted forever without tending. Osric agreed, though he used fewer words, simply nodding that stone wanted to endure, needed only occasional help remembering how. Brother Thomas smiled at this, recognizing the philosophy that had guided the stonemason's work for decades, and continued toward the kitchen, his basket swaying gently with each step. The scent of apples lingered after he departed, sweet, slightly fermented where the fruit had begun to bruise. With all 4 stones removed, Osric examined the wall's foundation where they had rested. The mortar had indeed crumbled completely, leaving only sandy residue that he brushed away with his fingers. The stone beneath looked sound, showing no cracks or weaknesses, simply awaiting fresh mortar and the return of its missing pieces. He reached for his pouch and began applying the lime mixture, spreading it evenly across the foundation, building up a bed that would hold the stones securely once they were replaced. The first stone went back into position with a satisfying solidity. Osric tapped it gently with his wooden mallet, testing its stability, adjusting its angle slightly until it sat perfectly level with its neighbors. The second stone required more attention. He removed it twice, added more mortar, tried again, seeking that precise balance where the weight distributed evenly and the stone felt locked into place by gravity and craft working together. By the time all 4 stones had been reset, the sun stood nearly overhead. Osric, 63 years old, straightened slowly, pressing one hand against the small of his back, feeling the pleasant ache of sustained effort. His work-weathered hands bore fresh traces of lime mortar, white against his tanned skin, and he wiped them absently on his leather apron while surveying the completed repair. The wall stood firm again, its line unbroken, ready to serve its humble purpose of separating garden from orchard for another generation or two. He walked to the fountain in the main courtyard to wash. The water splashed into the stone basin with its eternal music, clear and cold, and he plunged his hands into the stream, feeling the lime dissolve and drift away. A small bird, perhaps a wren, landed on the fountain's rim, drinking delicately before flying off toward the church roof. Osric watched it disappear against the pale stone, then cupped his palms to drink himself, tasting the mineral sweetness he had known for 40 years. The afternoon stretched before him with the particular spaciousness that came after completing planned tasks. Osric retrieved his tools from the garden wall and returned them to his workshop, hanging each implement in its proper place, storing his leather pouch of remaining mortar in the cool dimness where it would stay workable for another day or two. The workshop smelled of stone dust and linseed oil, familiar as his own breath, and he stood for a moment in its center, simply present, letting his gaze rest on the organized tools, the stacked blocks of limestone waiting for future need, the wooden workbench worn smooth by decades of use. A thought occurred to him. He might walk to the quarry this afternoon. The monastery owned a small stone quarry perhaps half a mile distant, where Osric occasionally went to select new blocks for major repairs. He hadn't visited in several weeks, and the walk would be pleasant, the quarry itself peaceful in its own stark way, all exposed rock faces and accumulated stone chips, a place where the earth's bones showed through its skin. He set off along the path that wound through the beech grove and across the open hillside beyond. The grass had begun to turn golden with approaching autumn, and crickets sang from hidden places, their sound rising and falling like breath. The path climbed gradually, offering views back toward the monastery, its church tower rising above the surrounding walls, smoke from the kitchen chimney drifting lazily upward. The whole complex nestled into the valley as though it had grown there naturally, rather than been built by human effort. At the quarry, Osric stood at the edge and looked down into the shallow excavation. Stone layers revealed themselves in horizontal bands, each representing some ancient moment when sediment had settled and hardened into rock. He descended carefully, his feet finding purchase on the rough slope, until he stood on the quarry floor surrounded by blocks in various stages of cutting. Some showed chisel marks where previous masons had begun shaping them. Others remained rough, still wearing the fracture patterns from when they'd been split free from the bedrock. He ran his hands over the nearest block, feeling its surface, learning its character. This particular stone had a fine grain, dense and even, ideal for detailed work or locations requiring extra strength. Osric made a mental note of its position. When the monastery next needed such a stone, he would return here, would direct the hired laborers to this specific block. The knowledge pleased him, this cataloging of available materials, this forward planning that connected present observation to future need. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sweeping across the quarry floor. Osric watched it ride the thermal currents, wings spread motionless, simply being carried by forces invisible but utterly reliable. The bird's flight reminded him of his own work, finding the natural patterns, the existing strengths, and working with them rather than against them. Stone wanted to be stone, wanted to bear weight and endure weather. His role was merely to arrange it properly, to honor its nature while shaping it to human purpose. He climbed out of the quarry as the afternoon began its slow decline toward evening. The walk back to the monastery took him through the beech grove again, where the light now slanted low through the trees, creating long shadows that stretched across the path. Leaves whispered overhead, their sound like distant conversation, and the air had begun to cool, that first hint of night's approach that made the remaining warmth feel precious, worth savoring. By the time he reached the monastery walls, the bells were ringing for vespers. Osric detoured to his cottage to wash properly and change his tunic. The one he'd worn all day bore too much stone dust and lime staining for the church service. His clean tunic, kept folded on a wooden shelf, smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Brother Anselm had given him last spring. The scent released as he pulled the garment over his head, and he caught himself smiling at this small luxury, this gentle thoughtfulness from a friend who knew that even a solitary stonemason might appreciate such touches. The church gradually filled with brothers moving to their customary places. Osric took his position near the back, noting how the evening light streaming through the western windows had turned golden, almost amber, warming the stone walls from within. Brother Godfrey's young voice rose in the opening chant, pure and clear, and the older brothers joined on the responses, their tones deeper, rougher, but no less sincere. The sound filled the vaulted space, resonating in ways that Osric felt in his chest, vibrations that seemed to harmonize with his heartbeat. When the service concluded, he remained seated for a while after the brothers had departed. The church in twilight held a particular quality, neither bright nor dark, but suspended between states, peaceful in its emptiness. Candles still burned on the altar, their flames steady in the still air, and Osric watched them for a time, his mind quiet, his body relaxed from the day's labor. He felt the satisfaction that came from work completed well, from stones reset and walls made whole, from the ongoing conversation between craft and care that had shaped his entire adult life. Eventually, he rose and made his way outside, where dusk had settled across the valley. Stars had begun appearing in the eastern sky, faint at first, then growing brighter as full darkness approached. Osric walked slowly toward his cottage, in no hurry, content to move through the deepening night with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. His graying red hair, more silver than copper in this light, caught the last remnants of sunset, and his work-weathered hands swung loosely at his sides, tired but satisfied. Inside his cottage, he lit a rushlight and prepared a simple supper: bread, cheese, a handful of walnuts from the monastery's trees, and water sweetened with a small amount of honey. He ate at his wooden table, chewing slowly, aware of flavors and textures present to each moment. Through his small window, he could see the monastery walls and beyond them the rising moon, not quite full but bright enough to cast shadows, to turn the familiar landscape into something slightly mysterious, slightly magical. After his meal, he sat near the hearth and examined a chisel that needed sharpening. The work required concentration but not strain, holding the blade at the correct angle against the whetstone, moving it in smooth strokes, checking the edge periodically until it achieved the proper keenness. The rhythmic sound of metal on stone filled the cottage, a quiet scraping that felt companionable rather than lonely. Osric, 63 years old, had performed this task hundreds of times, and his hands knew exactly what to do, requiring almost no guidance from his conscious mind. When the chisel satisfied him, he set it aside and simply sat, watching the fire burn down to coals. The warmth felt pleasant on his face, and the subtle crackling of settling embers provided the only sound beyond his own breathing. Tomorrow would bring more work, perhaps addressing that loose threshold in the library, or checking the church's north wall for weathered mortar. The specific tasks didn't matter particularly. What mattered was the showing up, the paying attention, the bringing of skill and patience to whatever needed doing. He rose finally and prepared for sleep, banking the fire, extinguishing the rushlight, removing his tunic and folding it carefully for morning. The wool blanket felt soft against his skin as he pulled it over his shoulders, and the straw mattress had long since shaped itself to his body, providing comfortable support. Through the window, moonlight painted silver patterns on the floor, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called its hunting cry, lonely and beautiful. Osric's breathing deepened, his muscles relaxed, and he drifted toward sleep with the same gentle inevitability that carried the moon across the sky, that turned seasons one into another, that wore stone smooth over centuries of patient time. Dawn arrived with mist clinging to the valley floor, turning the monastery into an island floating in white vapor. Osric stood at his cottage door, watching the slow revelation as sunlight touched the church tower first, then gradually burned through the lower layers of fog. The air tasted damp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of wet grass and stone, and he breathed it deeply before turning back inside to break his fast with bread and ale left from the previous evening. His plan for the day centered on the library threshold, that loose stone Brother Cyprian had mentioned in passing nearly a week ago. The library occupied a newer section of the monastery, built perhaps 50 years prior, and its stones hadn't yet achieved the settled quality of the older buildings. Sometimes newer construction required more frequent attention, the materials still learning how to work together, finding their final positions through subtle shifts and adjustments that might take decades to complete. After eating, Osric gathered the tools he would need: his narrowest pry bar for lifting the threshold stone, fresh mortar, his leveling string, and the small wooden wedges he used for precise positioning. The leather satchel hung comfortably on his shoulder as he stepped outside, where the mist had thinned enough to reveal the courtyard fountain and the herb garden beyond. Brother Anselm moved among the plants, gathering sage and thyme, his basket already half filled with fragrant bundles that would hang drying in the kitchen. The library door stood open despite the early hour. Brother Cyprian, the monastery's librarian, believed fresh air benefited the manuscripts as much as it did human lungs, and he maintained a careful balance between preserving the books and preventing the mustiness that could develop in enclosed spaces. Osric found him at his usual station near the tall reading desk, copying text from an older volume onto fresh vellum, his quill moving with practiced precision across the page. The elderly monk looked up and smiled, setting aside his quill carefully. He had hoped Osric would come today, he mentioned quietly, keeping his voice low in deference to the library's customary silence. The loose threshold had begun to rock noticeably underfoot, and he worried it might crack if left unattended much longer. Osric nodded, already kneeling to examine the stone in question, running his work-weathered hands along its edges, feeling how it had shifted slightly upward on one end, creating an uneven surface that caught the unwary foot. Brother Cyprian returned to his copying while Osric began the careful work of removal. The threshold stone, perhaps 3 feet long and 8 inches wide, had settled unevenly because the mortar beneath had compressed on one side, probably due to the natural settling of the building's foundation. Nothing alarming, simply the ongoing adjustments that all structures made as they aged. He worked his pry bar into the gap, applying pressure gradually, rocking the stone gently until it loosened enough to lift free. With the stone removed and set aside, Osric examined the cavity it had occupied. The mortar showed clear compression on the western side, while the eastern side remained relatively intact. He would need to remove all the old mortar, build up the foundation evenly, and reset the threshold perfectly level. The work would take most of the morning, but there was no hurry, no deadline except his own standards of craftsmanship. He began chipping away the old mortar, his chisel tapping rhythmically against the hardened material. The sound echoed softly in the library's quiet space, a measured percussion that seemed appropriate somehow, like a slow drumbeat underlying Brother Cyprian's silent work with quill and vellum. Dust rose from the cavity, pale and fine, and Osric paused periodically to brush it away, keeping his work area as clean as possible out of respect for the manuscripts surrounding him. Sunlight had fully entered the valley by the time he finished clearing the old mortar. Osric, 63 years old, straightened from his kneeling position and walked outside to mix fresh mortar at the courtyard fountain, measuring the lime powder and water carefully, achieving the consistency he needed for this particular application. His graying red hair lifted slightly in the morning breeze, and he paused to observe a pair of swallows swooping low over the fountain, their flight paths intersecting and separating in patterns that seemed choreographed but were utterly spontaneous. Back in the library, he spread the new mortar carefully, building up the compressed side until the cavity floor sat perfectly level. He used his leveling string to verify the surface, stretching it taut and checking from multiple angles, ensuring precision before the mortar began to set. Brother Cyprian glanced up occasionally from his manuscript work, watching the stonemason's methodical progress with an expression of quiet appreciation. Both men practiced crafts that demanded patience and attention, and there was recognition in the librarian's gaze, an understanding of kindred dedication. When Osric finally lowered the threshold stone back into position, it settled with a satisfying solidity. He tapped it gently with his mallet, checking its stability, verifying that it no longer rocked or shifted. The fit pleased him. The stone sat flush with the surrounding floor, level from end to end, ready to bear the weight of countless footsteps without complaint. He cleaned away the excess mortar that had squeezed out from the joints, smoothed the visible edges, and gathered his tools. Brother Cyprian set aside his quill and approached to examine the repair. He knelt with some difficulty, his old knees protesting, and ran his fingers across the threshold exactly as Osric had done earlier. The surface felt smooth, uninterrupted, as though the stone had never moved. He expressed his gratitude simply, nodding that such work deserved recognition even if it often went unnoticed. Osric replied that the best repairs were indeed invisible, that craft showed itself most clearly in what didn't draw attention, and Brother Cyprian nodded, seeing truth in this observation. The stonemason left the library as the bells rang for terce. The morning service would draw most of the brothers to the church, and Osric found himself following, attracted by the promise of chanted prayers and the cool dimness of the stone interior. He took his customary place near the back and let the Latin phrases wash over him, not struggling to translate, but simply receiving the sound and rhythm, the way the community's voices blended and separated, creating harmonies that seemed to rise toward the vaulted ceiling before settling back down like gentle rain. After the service, he walked through the monastery grounds without particular destination, simply observing, noting small details that might require future attention. The well's wooden bucket showed wear along its rope attachment, perhaps another month before it needed replacement. One of the kitchen shutters hung slightly crooked, a matter of adjusting the iron hinge. The path leading to the chapter house had developed a shallow depression where water collected after rain. He might reset those pavers next week. His wandering brought him to the orchard, where Brother Thomas knelt among the apple trees, examining the fruit with a practiced eye. The elderly monk looked up and gestured for Osric to join him. The harvest would begin soon, he explained, perhaps within the week if the weather held. He pointed to one particular apple, still on the branch but showing the deep red coloring that indicated perfect ripeness. Would Osric help with the harvest, as he had done in previous years? The work went faster with additional hands, and the brothers always appreciated his steady presence. Osric agreed readily. He had always enjoyed harvest time, the physical labor different from stonework, but no less satisfying, the satisfaction of gathering abundance, the communal effort that brought the entire monastery together in shared purpose. Brother Thomas smiled and patted Osric's shoulder, the gesture conveying warmth and friendship cultivated over decades of working side by side through changing seasons. They walked together toward the refectory, where the midday meal awaited. The brothers had already gathered, and the reader had begun the customary scripture passage, his voice carrying through the hall with measured cadence. Osric and Brother Thomas found seats at one of the long tables and waited as wooden bowls of pottage were passed down the rows, followed by fresh bread still warm from the oven. The pottage today contained lentils and leeks, simple fare but nourishing, seasoned with herbs from Brother Anselm's garden. Osric ate slowly, aware of flavors and textures, the earthiness of lentils, the mild sweetness of leeks, the yeasty richness of bread. Across the table, Brother Godfrey smiled at him, and Osric nodded in return, this small acknowledgement sufficient between them. The refectory's silence felt comfortable rather than restrictive, a shared quietness that allowed each person to be present to their own thoughts while remaining connected to the community. After the meal, Osric returned to his workshop to organize his tools and assess his supply of materials. The lime powder stores looked adequate for another month, maybe two, depending on how many repairs presented themselves. His collection of chisels needed attention. Several had dulled edges that wanted sharpening. He spent the afternoon at this task, working each blade against the whetstone with the same patient rhythm he brought to all his work, checking edges by drawing them carefully across his thumbnail, feeling for the keenness that indicated proper sharpening. The sound of metal on stone filled the workshop, a meditative scraping that seemed to slow time, to create a pocket of focused presence within the afternoon's gradual progression. Sunlight moved across the floor as hours passed, marking the day's arc without urgency. Osric hummed plainchant melodies while working, the low tones barely audible, familiar as his own heartbeat. When all the chisels had been sharpened and returned to their pegs, he stepped outside to find the day had advanced toward evening. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard, and the light had taken on that golden quality that preceded sunset. The monastery walls glowed amber, warm and beautiful, and Osric stood simply observing this transformation, the way ordinary stone became luminous when touched by departing sun. Brother Anselm appeared from the herb garden, moving slowly, carrying a basket of freshly harvested lavender. The elderly monk paused beside Osric, and they stood together in companionable silence, watching the light change. After a while, Brother Anselm spoke quietly, mentioning that he had bundled extra lavender for Osric's cottage if he wanted it. The harvest had been particularly generous this year, more than the monastery's immediate needs required. Osric accepted the offer with genuine pleasure. He appreciated the gentle fragrance, the way it softened the stone dust smell that pervaded his living space. Brother Anselm handed him several bundles, their stems tied with twine, the purple flowers still vibrant despite being cut. The scent rose between them, sweet and calming, and Osric held the lavender carefully, already imagining how he would hang it from the rafters of his cottage, where it would dry slowly and release its perfume for months. They walked together toward the church as the Vespers bells began to ring. The service drew the day toward its close with prayers and chanted psalms, the brothers' voices rising and falling in patterns worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Osric listened with his eyes half closed, feeling the vibrations in his chest, aware of his own breathing synchronizing with the rhythm of the prayers. When the final blessing had been spoken and the brothers began to depart, he remained seated for a few moments longer, reluctant to break the peaceful spell. Outside, dusk had settled across the valley. Stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and the air had cooled noticeably, carrying hints of the autumn to come. Osric walked to his cottage with the lavender bundles cradled carefully in his arms, his footsteps barely audible on the worn path. Smoke rose from several of the monastery chimneys, thin gray columns ascending into the evening air, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Inside his cottage, he hung the lavender from an iron hook embedded in one of the ceiling beams. The bundles swayed slightly, releasing fresh waves of scent with each movement, and Osric stood beneath them, breathing deeply, grateful for this simple gift. He lit his rushlight and prepared his evening meal: bread, cheese, a small portion of dried fish, and water sweetened with honey. The food sustained him without demanding attention, and he ate while watching the firelight dance on the stone walls. After supper, he sat near the hearth with no particular task, simply present to the evening's quietness. His work-weathered hands rested on his knees, and he watched the flames consume the wood gradually, transforming solid matter into heat and light and ash. The process felt instructive somehow, this reminder of impermanence, of constant change occurring even in things that seemed stable and enduring. Osric, 63 years old, had built this cottage with his own hands, had quarried its stones and mortared them into walls that would probably outlast him by generations. Yet even these walls would eventually crumble, would return to the earth from which they'd been lifted. The thought didn't sadden him. Instead, he found comfort in it. This acknowledgement that his work participated in cycles larger than individual human life, that craft and care mattered precisely because nothing lasted forever without them. He prepared for sleep as the fire burned down to coals. The lavender scent had already begun to fill the cottage, mingling with the familiar smells of stone dust and wood smoke. Through his window, the moon had risen, nearly full now, casting silver light across the valley. Somewhere an owl called, its voice carrying across the darkness, lonely and beautiful. Beneath his wool blanket, Osric's breathing deepened and slowed. His body relaxed into the mattress, muscles releasing the day's efforts, and his mind drifted toward sleep with the same unhurried grace that had marked all his waking hours. The last conscious thought that moved through his awareness was gratitude for work completed, for friendships maintained, for the simple abundance of days spent in the company of stone and sky, silence and community, solitude and belonging. The morning came quietly, wrapped in silence so complete that Osric woke to nothing but his own breathing. No bells had rung yet, and the valley remained shrouded in darkness, that deep hour before dawn when the world felt suspended between night and day. He lay still for a time, warm beneath his blanket, aware of the lavender scent drifting down from the rafters, listening to the profound stillness that surrounded his cottage like water. Eventually, he rose and dressed, pulling on his woolen hose and linen tunic, feeling the familiar weight of fabric settle against his skin. The fire had died completely during the night, leaving only cold ash in the hearth, and he knelt to rebuild it, arranging kindling carefully before striking flint to steel. The sparks caught after several attempts, and small flames began to grow, pushing back the darkness, bringing warmth and light back into the stone-walled space. He broke his fast with bread and ale, eating slowly while the cottage gradually warmed. Through the window, he could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern sky, that subtle shift from black to gray that preceded true sunrise by perhaps half an hour. The monastery remained quiet, not even the earliest rising brothers stirring yet, and Osric appreciated this stolen time, these moments that belonged entirely to himself. By the time he stepped outside, dawn had strengthened enough to reveal shapes and shadows. Mist rose from the valley floor again, thinner than yesterday but still present, softening edges and muting colors. Osric walked to the well and drew water for washing, the bucket rising with a familiar creaking of rope and pulley. The water felt shockingly cold against his face and hands, bracing, and he gasped slightly before his skin adjusted to the temperature. The bells rang for lauds as he dried himself with a linen cloth. The sound carried clearly through the still air, calling the brothers to their first prayers of the day. Osric had no particular tasks planned for this morning. The library threshold was complete, the garden wall secure, the chapter house crack properly mended. He decided he would spend time in the scriptorium, where Brother Hugh had mentioned that one of the stone window seats had developed a crack running through its surface. A small repair, requiring perhaps 2 hours of work, but worthy of attention nonetheless. He gathered his tools and made his way through the awakening monastery. Brothers moved along the covered walkways toward the church, their wool robes rustling softly, their footsteps barely audible on the worn flagstones. Osric joined the stream of movement briefly before branching off toward the scriptorium, a separate building that housed the monastery's writing and copying work. Inside, the scriptorium felt cool and still. 3 writing desks stood in a row beneath tall windows designed to capture morning light, and wooden storage chests lined the walls, containing the precious materials of the scribe's craft: vellum, inks, quills, and the manuscripts themselves in various stages of completion. The damaged window seat occupied the eastern wall, a broad stone shelf where scribes could sit and rest their eyes from close work, gazing out at the garden while their vision adjusted. Osric examined the crack carefully. It ran diagonally across the seat's surface, perhaps 8 inches long, clearly the result of someone sitting heavily on a weak point in the stone. The crack hadn't penetrated all the way through. When he tapped the stone lightly with his knuckles, it still rang solid rather than hollow. A surface repair would suffice, filling and smoothing, strengthening the weakened area without needing to replace the entire seat. He knelt on the floor and began cleaning the crack, removing loose fragments and dust, preparing the stone to receive mortar. The work felt meditative, requiring attention without strain, and he hummed plainchant melodies while working, the low tones barely audible in the scriptorium's quiet. Sunlight gradually filled the space as morning advanced, streaming through the windows in bright shafts that illuminated the floating dust particles Osric's cleaning had disturbed. Brother Hugh arrived as Osric began applying mortar to the crack. The scribe, perhaps 40 years old with ink-stained fingers and keen eyes, watched the repair process with interest. He mentioned that he spent many hours seated on that particular windowsill, appreciating how it offered a view of Brother Anselm's garden, while remaining close enough to his writing desk that he could easily return to work. The crack had worried him, not for safety, but because he feared it might worsen and eventually require the seat's complete replacement. Osric assured him the repair would hold for many years if done properly, which he intended to do. The crack, while visible, hadn't compromised the stone's fundamental integrity. With proper filling and finishing, the seat would bear weight as reliably as ever. Brother Hugh nodded, satisfied, and moved to his writing desk, where an unfinished manuscript awaited his attention. Soon the only sounds in the scriptorium were the gentle scraping of Osric's trowel and the soft scratching of Brother Hugh's quill on vellum. The repair progressed smoothly. Osric worked the mortar into the crack carefully, ensuring it penetrated fully, leaving no air pockets that might weaken the bond. His work-weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, guided by decades of experience, requiring almost no conscious direction. He smoothed the surface repeatedly, checking with his fingers for any remaining roughness, building up the filled area, slightly proud of the surrounding stone so that final finishing would bring it perfectly flush. By the time the bells rang for terce, the repair sat complete, needing only time to cure properly before final smoothing. Osric cleaned his tools and gathered his satchel, nodding farewell to Brother Hugh, who looked up from his manuscript long enough to smile his thanks. The stonemason stepped outside into a morning that had grown warm and bright. The mist completely burned away, leaving clear air and brilliant sunshine that made the monastery walls glow like honey. He decided to walk the perimeter of the entire monastery complex, something he did periodically to assess the overall condition of the structures. The circuit would take perhaps an hour, moving slowly, observing carefully, noting anything that warranted future attention. Osric, 63 years old, set off along the outer wall, his hand trailing occasionally along the stone surface, feeling for cracks or loose mortar through his fingertips' sensitive reading. The wall stood perhaps 10 feet tall, built of local fieldstone laid in careful courses, topped with flat coping stones that shed rainwater away from the joints. Overall, it appeared sound, showing the settled stability of construction now more than a century old. Here and there Osric noted small areas where mortar had weathered, places he would return to eventually with fresh material and patient attention. Nothing urgent, simply the ongoing maintenance that all masonry required. His circuit brought him past the kitchen garden, where Brother Anselm worked among the late-season vegetables. The elderly monk straightened from his weeding and hailed Osric, gesturing for him to approach. Did the stonemason have time to look at the garden shed? One of its stone foundation corners had begun to sink slightly, causing the wooden structure above to lean in a way that concerned Brother Anselm. Nothing immediate, but worth examining before winter arrived with its freezing and thawing cycles that could worsen any weakness. Osric agreed readily and followed Brother Anselm to the shed, a small building that housed tools and supplies for the garden work. The sinking corner revealed itself clearly. The foundation stone had settled perhaps 2 inches lower than its neighbors, tilting the entire structure noticeably. Osric knelt to examine the situation, probing the ground around the stone with his fingers, discovering that water drainage from the garden had gradually eroded the soil beneath the foundation, creating a void that allowed the settling. The repair would require lifting the shed's corner slightly, excavating beneath the foundation stone, improving drainage, and resetting everything level. Not difficult work, but requiring careful planning and probably an assistant to help with the lifting. Osric explained this to Brother Anselm, who listened attentively and suggested they might tackle the project next week, after the apple harvest had concluded and additional hands would be available. They walked back through the garden together, Brother Anselm pointing out various plants and their progress, the carrots ready for harvest, the late cabbages still swelling, the herbs that would need final cutting before frost. The elderly monk spoke with genuine affection for these growing things, his voice carrying the same careful attention that Osric brought to stonework. Both men understood craft, understood the satisfaction of tending something over time, watching it flourish through patient application of skill and care. The bells rang for sext as they parted, Brother Anselm returning to his weeding and Osric continuing his wall inspection. The midday service would draw the brothers to the church, But Osric chose to continue his circuit, knowing he could attend Vespers later. The wall's southern section stretched ahead, running parallel to the orchard, and he moved along it slowly, his hand maintaining contact with the stone, his eyes scanning for any concerns. A family of swallows had built their mud nest in a sheltered nook where the wall met the church's southern transept. Osric paused to watch the parent birds swooping in and out, feeding their young, who chirped urgently from within the nest. The birds paid him no attention, focused entirely on their task, and he appreciated their industry, their dedication to this small family that would soon scatter but for now remained tightly bound by need and instinct. His circuit complete, Osric returned to his workshop to find Brother Thomas waiting outside. The elderly monk explained that the abbot had asked whether Osric might examine the chapter house's reading lectern, the stone pedestal that held the great book during community meetings. One of the supporting columns appeared to have developed a slight wobble, and while it posed no immediate danger, the abbot preferred to address such matters before they worsened. Osric agreed to look at it immediately. The two men walked together to the chapter house, where the lectern stood in its customary position near the center of the room. The pedestal consisted of a circular base supporting 3 slender columns that rose to hold the angled reading surface. Osric examined each column carefully, pressing against them, testing for movement. The easternmost column did indeed shift slightly when pressed, its base having loosened from the circular foundation. Brother Thomas watched as Osric knelt to examine the joint where column met base. The mortar there had cracked and partially crumbled, probably due to the slight expansion and contraction that all stone experienced with temperature changes. A straightforward repair. Remove the damaged mortar, clean the joint thoroughly, reapply fresh material, allow proper curing time. He explained this to Brother Thomas, estimating the work would require most of tomorrow morning. The elderly monk expressed his gratitude and departed, leaving Osric alone in the chapter house. The space felt peaceful in its emptiness, afternoon light streaming through high windows, dust motes drifting lazily through the illuminated air. Osric sat on one of the stone benches that lined the walls, simply resting for a moment, his graying red hair touched by sunlight, his work-weathered hands folded loosely in his lap. These moments of pause had become increasingly important to him as the years accumulated. Not because the work tired him more, his strength remained adequate for his tasks, but because he had learned to value stillness, to recognize it as essential rather than wasteful. The stones he worked with had taught him this, their patient endurance, their willingness to simply be, to exist without striving or urgency. Eventually, he rose and made his way to the refectory, where the midday meal awaited. The brothers had already begun eating, and Osric found a place at the end of one table, accepting the wooden bowl of pottage that was passed to him. Today's meal featured barley and mushrooms, earthy and satisfying, accompanied by dark bread and a small portion of fresh butter that had been churned that morning. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the communal silence that wrapped around the simple act of nourishment. After the meal, Osric returned to his cottage for a brief rest. The afternoon had grown warm, almost hot, and he lay on his bed with the door open to catch any breeze that might stir. Through the window he could see a portion of sky, brilliantly blue, crossed occasionally by birds whose species he couldn't identify from this angle. The lavender scent drifted down from the rafters, mixing with the warmer smells of sun-heated stone and dried grass. He didn't sleep, but drifted in that space between waking and sleeping, his mind quiet, his body relaxed. Time passed without his awareness of its passing, until eventually the angle of light through his window shifted enough to rouse him. He rose and splashed water on his face, feeling refreshed, ready to spend the remaining afternoon hours in useful occupation. His task for these hours would be preparing mortar for tomorrow's lectern repair. The work required careful measurement and mixing, achieving exactly the right consistency for filling narrow joints between stone surfaces. Osric measured lime powder into his wooden mixing trough, added water gradually while stirring, watching the mixture transform from dry powder to workable paste. The alkaline scent rose from the trough, sharp and clean, and he paused periodically to test the consistency between his fingers, seeking that precise balance where the mortar would bond strongly without being too thick to work into small spaces. When satisfied with the mixture, he covered the trough with damp cloth to keep the mortar from drying prematurely. Tomorrow morning he would return, check the consistency, perhaps add a small amount of water if needed, and then carry the mortar to the chapter house for the repair work. The preparation pleased him, this setting of things in order, this readiness for tomorrow's tasks. The afternoon had advanced toward evening by the time he finished cleaning his tools and organizing his workspace. Osric stepped outside to find the air had cooled noticeably, the heat giving way to the comfortable temperature that characterized autumn evenings in this valley. He walked toward the orchard, drawn by no particular purpose, simply wanting to move through the monastery grounds as day declined toward night. Brother Thomas knelt among the apple trees, examining fruit with the critical eye of someone planning an imminent harvest. He looked up as Osric approached and gestured to the laden branches above. Tomorrow, he announced, they would begin gathering. The weather looked favorable for the next several days, and the apples had reached perfect ripeness. Would Osric join them at dawn to help with the work? Osric agreed, feeling anticipation at the prospect. Harvest time brought a different rhythm to monastery life, a shared intensity of purpose that gathered everyone together in common cause. He enjoyed the physical labor, the satisfaction of gathering abundance, the communal meals that followed long days of work. Brother Thomas smiled and patted his shoulder, this gesture carrying warmth accumulated over years of friendship. They walked together toward the church as the Vespers bells began their evening call. The service gathered the day toward its close with familiar prayers and chanted psalms, the brothers' voices rising in harmonies that seemed to fill not just the stone building, but the entire valley surrounding it. Osric stood in his customary place, eyes half closed, breathing in rhythm with the chanting, feeling himself part of something larger than his individual existence. When the service ended and the brothers departed, he remained for a while in the dimming church. Candles burned on the altar, their flames steady in the still air, casting dancing shadows on the carved stone columns. Osric, 63 years old, felt the deep contentment that had become his emotional baseline, this quiet satisfaction with the shape his life had taken, the work he performed, the community he served. Outside, twilight had settled across the valley, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening eastern sky. He walked slowly toward his cottage, aware of each footfall, present to the cooling air against his face, the sound of his own breathing, the familiar path beneath his feet. Smoke rose from the monastery chimneys, and somewhere a dog barked twice before falling silent. Inside his cottage, he lit his rushlight and prepared a simple supper, eating without hurry, watching firelight dance on stone walls. After his meal, he sat near the hearth with no particular task, simply present to the evening's quietness, grateful for the day that had passed and the night that now enfolded him in its gentle darkness. Dawn arrived with birdsong, dozens of voices greeting the morning from branches hidden in the orchard and the beech grove beyond. Osric woke to this chorus, lying still beneath his blanket, listening to the intricate layering of calls and responses. Thrushes sang their liquid melodies while wrens added sharper notes, and somewhere a wood pigeon repeated its gentle, drowsy phrase. The sounds wove together into something that felt less like noise and more like conversation. The birds discussing matters important to their world in a language he couldn't translate but somehow understood. He rose and dressed quickly, knowing the harvest would begin early to take advantage of the cool morning hours. After breaking his fast with bread and ale, he walked through the pre-dawn dimness toward the orchard, where several brothers had already gathered. Brother Thomas moved among them, assigning tasks and areas, his voice calm and measured despite the coordination required for the day's work. Wooden ladders leaned against trees, and woven baskets sat ready to receive the fruit. Osric joined Brother Godfrey near a particularly laden tree, its branches bowing under the weight of red apples that glowed even in the weak light. The young monk smiled in greeting and gestured upward, suggesting they begin with the highest fruit before working their way down. Osric positioned the ladder carefully, testing its stability before climbing, his work-weathered hands gripping the wooden rungs with the same sure touch he brought to handling stone. At the top of the ladder, surrounded by leaves and fruit, he began picking. Each apple required individual attention, a gentle twist to release it from the branch, a careful placement in the basket rather than dropping it to risk bruising. The work established its own rhythm, reach and twist in place, reach and twist in place, repeated hundreds of times but never quite identical. His graying red hair caught the strengthening dawn light, and the cool air felt pleasant against his face as he moved among the branches. Brother Godfrey worked from the ground, gathering fruit from the lower limbs, humming plain chant melodies that drifted up to where Osric balanced on his ladder. The young monk had a fine voice, pure and clear, and Osric found himself unconsciously timing his movements to match the rhythm of the chanting. When the basket hanging from the ladder filled, he descended carefully and emptied it into one of the larger collection baskets before climbing again to continue. The sun rose fully as the morning progressed, burning away the last traces of mist and warming the orchard with golden light. More brothers joined the harvest, spreading throughout the trees, their movements creating a gentle rustling that blended with birdsong and the occasional thump of a dropped apple finding earth. Brother Thomas moved among them, offering encouragement, checking the fruit quality, ensuring the work proceeded smoothly. By mid-morning, Osric's basket had been filled and emptied perhaps a dozen times. His arms felt pleasantly tired from reaching and lifting, and his legs had adjusted to the ladder's narrow rungs. He descended to take water from the bucket Brother Anselm had brought, drinking deeply, tasting the mineral sweetness that characterized the monastery's well. The elderly monk smiled and commented that Osric worked with the same steady patience he brought to stonework, never rushing but never wasting motion either. They rested briefly in the shade, sitting on the grass while their breathing returned to normal. Around them, the harvest continued with its gentle industry, baskets filling, ladders shifting from tree to tree, quiet conversations passing between workers. The air smelled of apples and earth and the particular green scent that fruit trees released when their branches were disturbed. Wasps circled lazily, drawn by the sweetness, and Osric watched one land on a fallen apple, its striped body gleaming in the sunlight. After the rest, he returned to his ladder and continued picking. The tree he worked now held fruit that had ripened unevenly. Some apples showed perfect red coloring, while others remained partially green. Brother Thomas had explained earlier that these less perfect specimens would go to the press for cider rather than storage. So Osric gathered them all without discrimination, trusting that sorting would happen later. The morning advanced toward noon, the sun climbing higher, bringing real warmth that made the work more taxing. Sweat dampened Osric's tunic, and he paused frequently now to wipe his forehead with his sleeve. Brother Godfrey had moved to another tree, and Osric worked alone, accompanied only by his own breathing and the continuing bird song that seemed never to cease entirely, one species taking up the melody as another paused. When the bells rang for sext, Brother Thomas called a halt to the harvesting. The brothers gathered near the collection baskets, perhaps 24 now filled with apples, and began carrying them toward the cellar where they would be sorted and stored. Osric joined this procession, hoisting a heavy basket onto his shoulder, feeling its weight settle comfortably against his body. The walk to the cellar took him through the courtyard and down a set of stone steps he had rebuilt 7 years prior, their surface still level and true. The cellar felt blessedly cool after the morning's heat. Stone shelves lined the walls, and Brother Cyprian had organized the storage system with typical librarian precision, each section designated for specific varieties, each basket labeled with the tree of origin. Osric set down his load where directed and returned for another, making several trips until all the morning's harvest had been transferred underground. The midday meal brought welcome rest and nourishment. The brothers gathered in the refectory, their faces flushed from exertion, their hands stained with apple juice and earth. The pottage today contained beans and onions, hearty and satisfying, accompanied by fresh bread and cups of small ale. Osric ate with genuine hunger, his body appreciating the fuel after hours of physical labor different from his usual work. Brother Thomas stood after the meal to announce that the afternoon's harvest would continue until the remaining trees had been cleared. He estimated another 4 or 5 hours of work, perhaps extending slightly past vespers, but the weather remained favorable and the fruit demanded gathering. The brothers nodded their agreement, accepting this necessity without complaint, and Osric felt himself nodding as well, ready to return to the ladders and baskets and the satisfying work of bringing in abundance. The afternoon proceeded much like the morning, though the heat made the labor more demanding. Osric worked methodically, packing himself, knowing that haste led to carelessness and carelessness to accidents. His 63 years had taught him the value of sustainable effort, of finding a rhythm that could be maintained for hours without exhausting the body's resources. He climbed and picked and descended, climbed and picked and descended, the repetition becoming almost meditative. Brother Hugh joined him at one point, the scribe trading quill for ladder, his ink-stained fingers now gathering apples alongside everyone else. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging brief comments about particularly fine specimens or awkwardly positioned fruit. The scribe proved capable despite his bookish life, moving with careful attention that Osric recognized as kindred to his own approach. By late afternoon, the final trees had been harvested. The collection baskets filled the courtyard in rows, perhaps 50 in total, representing several days' worth of eating and pressing and storage work. Brother Thomas surveyed the gathered abundance with evident satisfaction, thanking each worker individually, his gratitude genuine and personal. When he reached Osric, he clasped the stonemason's shoulder and spoke of how the monastery depended on such willing hands, such reliable presence year after year. Osric felt the warmth of this recognition, but deflected attention with typical modesty, suggesting that many hands had worked together and all deserved equal credit. Brother Thomas smiled, understanding this response as characteristic, and moved on to thank Brother Godfrey and the others. The community began dispersing toward various tasks, some to begin sorting fruit, others to clean and store the ladders and baskets, still others to prepare the evening meal that would feed hungry workers. Osric walked to the fountain to wash properly, removing his tunic and splashing water over his arms and chest and face. The cold shock felt glorious against sun-heated skin, and he stood dripping for a moment, letting the afternoon breeze begin the drying process. His work-weathered hands showed fresh green stains from handling stems and leaves, and he scrubbed them vigorously, watching the color gradually fade though not disappear entirely. After drying himself and pulling his tunic back on, he made his way to the chapter house, remembering the lectern repair he had promised to complete. The mortar he had prepared yesterday waited in his workshop, and he retrieved it along with his tools, checking the consistency and finding it still workable. The walk to the chapter house felt longer than usual, his legs tired from hours on the ladder, but he moved steadily, unhurried despite his fatigue. Inside the chapter house, the damaged lectern column awaited his attention. Osric knelt beside it and began the careful work of removing the crumbled mortar from the joint where column met base. His chisel tapped rhythmically, the sound echoing softly in the empty space, and he worked with his customary focus despite his body's tiredness. The repair deserved his full attention regardless of how the day had already challenged him. Sunlight slanted through the western windows as he cleaned the joint thoroughly, brushing away loose material, ensuring clean surfaces for the fresh mortar to bond against. The stone felt smooth and cool beneath his fingers, familiar as his own skin, and he ran his hands over it with something approaching affection. These stones had stood here for decades, would stand for decades more, their patient endurance a kind of testimony to the value of things built to last. He applied the fresh mortar carefully, working it into the joint with his smallest trowel, ensuring complete filling without air pockets. The column needed to remain perfectly vertical, perfectly aligned with its two companions, and he checked this repeatedly with his level, making tiny adjustments before the mortar began to set. His graying red hair fell forward across his forehead, and he brushed it back absently, leaving a faint smudge of lime on his temple. The repair progressed smoothly despite his tiredness. Osric had performed similar work thousands of times, and his hands knew what to do almost without conscious guidance. He smoothed the visible edges where mortar met stone, wiped away excess material, checked the alignment one final time. The column would need to cure overnight before bearing full weight again, but the repair sat complete, solid, ready to serve the lectern's purpose for years to come. He cleaned his tools methodically, this ritual feeling particularly important after a long day. Each implement received attention, wiped clean, checked for damage, returned to its proper place in his satchel. The trowel's blade still gleamed despite decades of use, testimony to careful maintenance, and Osric felt quiet pride in this evidence of respect for his craft's instruments. The bells were ringing for vespers as he emerged from the chapter house. Brothers moved along the covered walkways toward the church, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. Osric joined them, his body tired but his spirit peaceful, grateful for the day's varied labors, for the community that had worked together harvesting fruit, for the solitary repair work that had brought the day to its close. The service washed over him like cool water, the chanted prayers and psalms creating space for rest, for reflection, for the gentle release of effort. He stood in his customary place near the back, eyes half closed, feeling the vibrations of communal voice in his chest. When the final blessing had been spoken, he remained seated while others departed, reluctant to move, content to simply exist in the dimming church with its flickering candles and accumulated quietness. Eventually, he rose and walked outside into early evening. The air had cooled significantly, carrying the first real hint of autumn's approach, a crispness that spoke of changing seasons. Stars had begun appearing in the eastern sky, faint at first, then growing brighter as darkness deepened. Osric made his way toward his cottage, moving slowly, aware of his body's pleasant exhaustion, ready for simple food and rest. Inside, he lit his rushlight and prepared a modest supper: bread, cheese, and several of the apples he had helped harvest, their flesh sweet and crisp when bitten. He ate at his table, chewing slowly, savoring flavors earned through his own labor. The apple's juice ran down his chin, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, smiling slightly at the simple pleasure. After eating, he sat near his hearth without building a fire. The evening felt mild enough that warmth seemed unnecessary. Through his window, moonlight painted silver patterns on the floor, and the lavender scent drifted down from the rafters, mixing with the lingering apple sweetness on his breath. His work-weathered hands rested on his knees, and he examined them in the dim light, seeing the day's evidence written in green stains and fresh calluses, in the slight tremor that came from sustained effort. Osric, 63 years old, felt the deep contentment that had become his natural state, this quiet satisfaction with days well spent, with work completed faithfully, with the ongoing rhythm of service and craft that shaped his life. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, perhaps finishing the scriptorium window seat, perhaps helping sort the harvested apples, perhaps addressing the garden shed's foundation that Brother Anselm had mentioned. The specific work mattered less than the showing up, the paying attention, the bringing of skill and patience to whatever needed doing. He prepared for sleep as full darkness settled over the valley. Beneath his wool blanket, his breathing deepened and his muscles released their final tensions, surrendering to rest. The last thought that moved through his awareness before sleep claimed him was gratitude, for strong hands and steady vision, for community and solitude both, for stones that waited patiently for his care, and for days that unfolded with reliable rhythm, each one different yet somehow the same, each one offering its own quiet abundance. Morning arrived with frost touching the grass, the first true evidence that autumn had moved beyond gentle suggestion into quiet assertion. Osric woke to see his breath misting in the cottage air, and he rose quickly to rebuild the hearth fire, kneeling before the cold ashes and arranging kindling with fingers that felt stiff from the chill. The flames caught and grew, pushing warmth back into the stone-walled space, and he held his hands near the fire, feeling sensation return gradually to his work-weathered skin. After dressing in his warmest woolen tunic and breaking his fast with porridge sweetened with honey, he stepped outside to find the monastery grounds transformed by the frost. Every blade of grass wore a delicate white coating, and the herb garden's remaining plants had taken on a crystalline beauty, their edges traced in silver. The sun had not yet risen high enough to burn away this frozen decoration, and Osric paused to appreciate the temporary loveliness, knowing it would vanish within the hour. His plan for the morning centered on returning to the scriptorium to complete the window seat repair. Yesterday's mortar would have cured sufficiently for final smoothing, and the work would take perhaps an hour, maybe less. He gathered his tools, the fine-grained whetstone, a dampened cloth, his smallest trowel, and made his way along paths that crunched softly beneath his feet, the frost breaking under each footfall. Brother Hugh had already arrived at the scriptorium when Osric entered, the scribe seated at his writing desk with quill in hand, copying text from an illuminated manuscript that glowed with colored inks and gold leaf. The elderly monk looked up and smiled, gesturing toward the window seat where yesterday's repair waited. The mortar had set beautifully, he observed, barely visible against the surrounding stone even without final finishing. Osric knelt beside the seat and ran his fingers over the repair, feeling the slight roughness that remained, the subtle ridge where new material met old stone. He dampened his cloth and began the smoothing work, using circular motions, applying steady pressure, feeling the mortar yield gradually to his touch. The whetstone came next, its fine grain removing the last imperfections, bringing the surface to a polish that matched the wear patterns of the surrounding seat. Brother Hugh's quill scratched softly in the background, a companionable sound that required no response, simply marking the passage of time through productive labor. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the scriptorium despite the morning chill outside, and Osric worked in a pool of golden light that seemed to bless the repair with its illumination. His graying red hair caught the brightness, and he felt warmth seeping through his tunic to his shoulders. When the repair satisfied his critical examination, smooth, level, indistinguishable from the original stone, except to someone who knew exactly where to look, He cleaned his tools and rose from his kneeling position. Brother Hugh set aside his quill and came to test the seat himself, running his own ink-stained fingers across the surface, sitting carefully to verify its stability. "Perfect," he pronounced, expressing gratitude for work that would let him continue his habit of resting here between copying sessions, gazing out at the garden while his eyes recovered from close focus on manuscript text. Osric nodded his acknowledgement and departed, stepping back into morning that had warmed considerably. The frost had vanished as predicted, leaving grass damp and glistening, and the monastery had fully awakened, brothers moving about their various tasks, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, the distant sound of someone chopping wood in steady rhythm. He made his way to his workshop to return his tools, organizing them carefully on their pegs and shelves, ensuring everything rested in its proper place. Brother Anselm appeared in the workshop doorway as Osric finished this organizing. The elderly monk wondered whether today might suit for addressing the garden shed's foundation, that sinking corner they had discussed several days prior. 2 novices had offered to help with the lifting, and the weather looked favorable for outdoor work that required digging and resetting stone. If Osric agreed, they could begin immediately after the midday meal. Osric accepted this plan readily. The repair would benefit from additional hands, and working alongside the novices might offer opportunity to share some of the craft knowledge he had accumulated over 40 years. Teaching pleased him when the students showed genuine interest, when they asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to answers. Brother Anselm departed to inform the novices, and Osric spent the remaining morning hours preparing the materials he would need: fresh mortar, wooden wedges for leveling, his heaviest pry bar for lifting. The bells rang for sext, calling the community to midday prayer. Osric joined the brothers in the church, standing in his customary place, letting the Latin phrases wash over him like gentle rain. The service felt particularly peaceful today, perhaps because his mind remained quiet, unburdened by worry or uncertainty, simply present to the moment and the communal voices rising in practiced harmony. After prayers came the midday meal, a thick soup of root vegetables and barley, accompanied by dark bread and hard cheese. Osric ate steadily, knowing the afternoon's work would demand physical strength. Across the table, 2 young novices watched him with something approaching awe. These boys, perhaps 16 years old, their faces still soft with youth. Brother Anselm had clearly told them they would be working with the monastery's stonemason, and they seemed both excited and nervous about the prospect. When the meal concluded, Osric gathered his tools and walked with Brother Anselm and the 2 novices toward the garden shed. The boys followed closely, listening as Brother Anselm explained the problem: the sinking foundation corner, the need to lift and reset, the importance of proper drainage to prevent future settling. Osric appreciated the elderly monk's clear explanation, which saved him from needing to repeat the information. At the shed, Osric organized everyone for the work ahead. The novices would provide lifting strength when needed, following his instructions precisely. Brother Anselm would manage the tools, passing items as requested. Osric himself would do the precise work, excavating beneath the foundation, assessing drainage issues, resetting the stone to proper level. He explained this division of labor clearly, emphasizing that following directions mattered more than strength or speed, that patience prevented accidents. The novices nodded solemnly, clearly determined to prove themselves worthy of this opportunity. Osric began by having them brace wooden supports against the shed's corner, creating temporary stability that would prevent collapse when the foundation stone was lifted. He supervised this carefully, checking each placement, adjusting angles until satisfied. The boys worked attentively, their young faces serious with concentration, and he found himself pleased by their carefulness. With the bracing complete, Osric positioned his heavy pry bar beneath the foundation stone and explained what would happen next. When he lifted, the novices would slide wooden wedges into the gap, holding the stone raised while he excavated beneath it. The work required coordination and attention. If anyone moved carelessly, if wedges slipped, injuries could result. The boys' eyes widened slightly at this caution, but they nodded understanding. Osric applied pressure to the pry bar gradually, feeling the stone's immense weight resisting, then slowly yielding as the leverage did its work. The foundation lifted perhaps an inch, and immediately both novices slid wedges into place, their movements quick but controlled. Osric released pressure carefully, verifying the wedges held securely before beginning the excavation work. Kneeling beside the raised stone, he began removing soil with his hands, discovering exactly what he had suspected. Water from the garden had gradually eroded the earth beneath the foundation, creating a void that allowed the settling. The soil felt damp even now, days after the last rain, indicating poor drainage that needed correction. He excavated carefully, removing loose material, widening the cavity enough to work comfortably. Brother Anselm passed him a wooden box filled with gravel, material that would drain freely rather than holding moisture. Osric began filling the excavated space with this gravel, tamping it down firmly, building up a base that would shed water rather than absorbing it. The work progressed slowly, requiring multiple additions of gravel, repeated tamping, constant verification of depth and levelness. The novices watched intently, asking occasional questions that showed they were truly trying to understand the process rather than simply following orders. One boy wondered why gravel rather than more soil. Osric explained about drainage, about how water trapped beneath foundations caused endless problems, how choosing the right material for each situation represented half of masonry's art. The novice nodded thoughtfully, clearly filing this knowledge away, and his companion asked about recognizing when drainage might be inadequate. Osric found himself warming to these young students, appreciating their genuine curiosity. By mid-afternoon, the gravel base sat complete and properly compacted. Osric had the novices remove the wedges slowly while he guided the foundation stone back down, checking constantly to ensure it settled level with its neighboring corners. The stone descended gradually, finding its new resting place with satisfying solidity. He tested it by pressing hard from multiple angles, verifying stability, confirming that the repair would hold. The final task involved removing the temporary bracing from the shed's corner. This too required care and coordination, each support released only after confirming the structure's stability. The novices worked attentively, following Osric's directions precisely, and when the last brace came away, the shed stood square and true, its lean corrected, its foundation solid once more. Brother Anselm inspected the completed work with evident satisfaction, running his hand along the shed's corner, noting how it now aligned properly with the rest of the structure. He thanked Osric warmly, then turned to the novices, praising their attentiveness and careful work. The boys flushed with pleasure at this recognition, clearly proud to have participated in skilled labor, to have contributed something concrete and lasting. Osric cleaned his tools while the novices helped Brother Anselm gather the wooden supports and unused materials. The afternoon had grown warm despite the morning's frost, and he felt sweat dampening his tunic, felt the pleasant ache in his muscles that came from sustained physical effort. His work-weathered hands bore fresh earth staining, and he brushed them against his leather apron, removing the worst of the soil. As they walked back toward the monastery's main buildings, one of the novices gathered courage to ask Osric how long he had been working with stone. 40 years, Osric replied, since he himself had been a boy not much older than them, apprenticed to an elderly mason who had taught him everything: how to read stone's character, how to mix mortar properly, how to work patiently without rushing, how to honor the materials and the craft itself. The novice asked whether it ever became boring, doing similar work year after year. Osric considered this question seriously before answering. No, he said finally, because no two stones were exactly alike, no two repairs identical, and there was always something new to learn, some subtle variation that required adapting technique. The work itself remained essentially the same, but attention revealed infinite variety within that sameness. The boy nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. His companion asked whether Osric ever wished he had learned a different craft, something that might have taken him beyond the monastery's walls. The stonemason smiled slightly and shook his head. This place had given him everything he needed: meaningful work, good companions, the satisfaction of tending something that would outlast his own life. What more could a man reasonably want? Brother Anselm made a sound of agreement, and they walked the remaining distance in comfortable silence. The novices departed toward their dormitory, and Osric continued to his workshop to properly clean and store his tools. The afternoon had advanced toward evening, and he found himself looking forward to the quiet hours ahead: vespers, simple supper, the peaceful solitude of his cottage as darkness settled over the valley. He washed at the courtyard fountain, scrubbing earth from his hands and arms, splashing cool water on his face. The monastery grounds had taken on that golden quality that characterized late afternoon in autumn, everything touched by slanting light that made ordinary stone seem luminous. Brother Thomas crossed the courtyard carrying a basket of sorted apples, and he paused to greet Osric, mentioning that tomorrow's work would include pressing cider from the bruised and misshapen fruit. Would the stonemason join them? The press was heavy work, requiring strong hands to turn the great wooden screw. Osric agreed willingly. He had helped with cider pressing in previous years and enjoyed the work's rhythm, the satisfaction of watching clear juice flow from crushed fruit, the sweet scent that filled the pressing shed. Brother Thomas smiled and continued toward the cellar, and Osric stood for a moment longer beside the fountain, listening to its eternal music, watching water catch and reflect the declining sun. The bells rang for vespers, calling the community to evening prayer. Osric made his way to the church, where candles already burned on the altar, their flames steady in the still air. The service gathered the day toward its close with familiar prayers and chanted psalms, the brothers' voices blending into harmonies that seemed to fill not just the stone building but the entire valley. He stood in his customary place, eyes half closed, breathing in rhythm with the chanting, feeling the day's efforts settle into his bones like a blessing. When the service concluded, he walked to his cottage through deepening twilight. The air had cooled again, carrying that same crispness that had brought morning frost, and he knew tonight would be cold, that he would need to build a proper fire rather than letting the hearth go dark. Inside, he arranged wood carefully, struck flint to steel, and soon flames were dancing cheerfully, pushing warmth into every corner of the stone-walled space. His evening meal consisted of bread, cheese, and an apple from yesterday's harvest, its flesh still crisp and sweet. He ate slowly, sitting near the fire, watching shadows play on the walls. The lavender scent drifted down from the rafters, and he breathed it deeply, grateful for Brother Anselm's thoughtfulness, for this small luxury that softened the edges of his solitary life. After eating, he sat with no particular task, simply present to the evening's quietness. His work-weathered hands rested on his knees, and he examined them in the firelight. These hands that had placed thousands of stones, that had mixed countless batches of mortar, that had shaped and smoothed and leveled more surfaces than he could possibly count. They showed every year of his craft, every season of his dedication, and he felt proud of them, grateful for their continuing strength and steadiness. Osric, 63 years old, prepared for sleep as the fire burned down to glowing coals. Through his window, stars filled the sky in brilliant profusion, their light reaching across distances he couldn't begin to comprehend. He lay beneath his wool blanket, feeling warmth seep through the fabric, feeling his breathing deepen and slow. Tomorrow would bring cider pressing, and after that, other tasks would present themselves, an endless succession of work that asked only for his patient attention and willing hands. Sleep came gently, consciousness fading like light at day's end, and his last awareness was gratitude for work completed faithfully, for community that valued his presence, for the ongoing rhythm of service and craft that gave shape and meaning to his days, each one different yet somehow the same, each one offering its own quiet abundance and simple, lasting peace. Morning came wrapped in clouds, the sky a uniform gray that held the promise of rain without yet releasing it. Osric woke to this muted light and lay listening for the sound of water against his cottage roof, but the rain remained suspended somewhere above, hesitating. He rose and stirred the banked coals in his hearth, adding kindling and small logs until flames revived, driving away the night's accumulated chill. After his morning meal of porridge and ale, he dressed warmly and made his way toward the pressing shed, a stone building near the orchard where the monastery's cider work took place each autumn. The structure stood open on one side to allow air circulation, and already he could see Brother Thomas and several others arranging the great wooden press, checking the mechanisms, positioning collection barrels beneath the spout where juice would flow. The press itself stood perhaps 7 feet tall, constructed of oak timbers dark with age and countless seasons of use. A massive wooden screw ran through its center, turned by a long handle that required two men working together to achieve the pressure necessary for proper extraction. Woven baskets waited nearby, filled with apples deemed unsuitable for storage. Those with bruises or blemishes, misshapen specimens, windfalls gathered from the orchard floor. Nothing would be wasted. Even imperfect fruit contained sweetness worth capturing. Brother Thomas greeted Osric with evident relief, mentioning that the work would go much easier with the stonemason's strength added to their number. The elderly monk had organized the day's labor into shifts. Some would feed apples into the grinding mill that crushed fruit into pulp. Others would load this pulp into cloth-lined pressing forms, and still others would work the great screw that squeezed juice from the crushed mass. Osric agreed to take his turn at all stations, moving where help was most needed. They began with the grinding mill, a circular stone trough where a heavy roller turned by hand pulverized whole apples into coarse pulp. Brother Godfrey and one of the novices from yesterday fed fruit steadily into the mill, while Osric and another brother turned the handle, feeling the roller's weight resist their efforts before yielding to steady pressure. The work established its own rhythm, push and step, and soon they had found a pace that could be sustained without exhaustion. The grinding released intense apple fragrance, sweet and slightly fermented where some fruit had already begun to age. This scent filled the pressing shed, mixing with the smell of damp stone and old wood, creating an atmosphere that felt both festive and industrious. Brother Thomas moved among them, offering encouragement, occasionally taking a turn at various stations to give others brief rest. After perhaps an hour of grinding, enough pulp had accumulated to begin the pressing work. Osric helped transfer the crushed fruit into cloth-lined wooden forms, these square frames that stacked atop one another beneath the press's central screw. Each layer of pulp was wrapped carefully in its cloth, creating a neat package that would release juice when pressure was applied, while retaining the solid matter for later disposal in the monastery's compost heap. With 6 layers stacked and ready, the actual pressing began. Osric took one end of the long handle while Brother Martin, a sturdy man perhaps 40 years old, took the other. Together they began turning the screw, feeling the handle's resistance increase as the press descended and began compressing the stacked forms. The work required coordinated effort, both men pushing in unison, stepping forward together, maintaining steady pressure rather than jerking or forcing. The first drops of juice appeared at the spout almost immediately, pale golden liquid that caught the diffuse light filtering through the pressing shed's open side. As pressure increased, the drops became a thin stream, then a more substantial flow that splashed into the waiting barrel with a sound like rain on water. The sweetness intensified, and Osric found himself breathing deeply, savoring this annual harvest ritual. They turned the screw until no more juice flowed, then reversed direction to release pressure and remove the spent pulp. The cloth-wrapped forms had compressed to perhaps half their original thickness, and when unwrapped, the pulp emerged as dry, compacted cakes that bore little resemblance to the fresh apples that had entered the mill. These spent cakes would enrich the monastery's gardens, returning nutrients to soil that would grow next year's vegetables. The work continued through the morning in this pattern, grinding, layering, pressing, emptying, then starting again. Osric moved between stations, sometimes turning the mill, sometimes managing the screw, occasionally helping Brother Godfrey feed apples into the grinder. His work-weathered hands grew sticky with juice, and his tunic absorbed spatters and splashes that would leave permanent staining. The physical labor felt good. This engagement of muscle and coordination, this participation in work that served the entire community's needs. By the time the bells rang for sext, they had filled 3 large barrels with fresh juice, perhaps 30 gallons total. Brother Thomas declared this sufficient for the day. The remaining apples would keep until tomorrow, and the brothers deserved rest and sustenance after their morning's efforts. They cleaned the equipment carefully, scrubbing the mill's stone surfaces, rinsing cloth pressing forms, covering the filled barrels with wooden lids weighted by stones. The midday meal brought particular satisfaction after the morning's sweet-scented work. The refectory's simple pottage and bread tasted richer somehow, more substantial, and Osric ate with genuine appetite. Around him, other workers showed similar hunger, and even the customary silence felt companionable rather than restrictive, everyone united by shared labor and its earned weariness. After eating, Osric decided to walk the monastery grounds rather than returning immediately to his cottage. The clouds had thickened overhead, and the air carried that peculiar heaviness that preceded rain, but still, the drops had not begun falling. He made his way along the covered walkways, observing the stones he had tended over 40 years, nodding here and there small areas that would eventually require attention. His circuit brought him past the church, and on impulse he stepped inside. The interior felt cool and dim, empty of people, filled only with the ambient presence that sacred spaces seem to hold even in the absence of active worship. Osric walked slowly down the central aisle, his footsteps barely audible on the worn flagstones, and found himself drawn to one particular column near the altar, a place where he had completed a major repair perhaps 15 years prior. The repair remained invisible to casual observation, but Osric knew exactly where to look, where to run his fingers to find the joints between old stone and new. He had replaced an entire section of the column after discovering dangerous cracks extending deep into the masonry, work that had required careful planning, precise cutting, and weeks of patient labor. The column now stood as solid as its companions, indistinguishable from them, and he felt quiet pride in this evidence of craft deployed in service of something meant to endure. He sat on one of the wooden choir stalls and simply rested, letting the church's quietness settle around him like a cloak. Rain began finally, the first drops striking the roof with soft percussion that gradually intensified into steady rainfall. The sound created a kind of shelter within shelter, the church protecting him from weather while the weather's voice provided accompaniment to his thoughts. Osric, 63 years old, found himself reflecting on the life he had built within these walls, the decades of work, the friendships formed through shared labor and prayer, the satisfaction of tending structures that would stand long after his hands had lost their strength. He had never married, had never traveled beyond the valley's boundaries, had devoted his entire adult existence to this single place and its stones. Some might call this a narrow life, but to him it felt complete, sufficient, rich with meaning that required no justification beyond itself. The rain continued, growing heavier, drumming on the roof with increased intensity. Through the high windows he could see gray curtains of water, and he knew the monastery's grounds would be transforming, paths becoming streams, gardens drinking deeply, stone walls darkening as they absorbed moisture. The rain would continue through the afternoon and likely into evening, creating a day defined by indoor work and contemplative rest. Eventually, he rose and walked back outside, pulling his hood over his graying red hair, accepting the rain's touch on his face and hands. The courtyard fountain overflowed its basin, and water ran freely across the flagstones, seeking low points, creating temporary channels that would disappear once the rain ceased. He made his way to his workshop, thinking he might spend the afternoon sharpening tools or organizing materials, productive work that required no exposure to weather. Inside the workshop, the rain's sound became muffled, almost musical, a backdrop to solitary labor. Osric lit a small oil lamp against the afternoon's dimness and set to work examining his collection of chisels, testing each edge, identifying those that needed attention. The work required no thought, only presence, and he settled into its rhythm easily, the rasp of metal on stone providing counterpoint to rain on roof. Time passed without his conscious awareness of its passing, marked only by the lamp's gradual consumption of oil and the growing pile of sharpened tools. Brother Anselm appeared in the doorway at some point, rain dripping from his hood, asking whether Osric had seen the leak that had developed in the refectory's roof. Water was coming through near the eastern corner, dripping onto one of the long tables, and the monks would appreciate the stonemason's assessment of the problem. Osric set aside his sharpening work and followed Brother Anselm through the rain to the refectory. Inside, several brothers had positioned a wooden bucket to catch the drips, which fell with steady rhythm, splashing into the growing pool below. Osric examined the ceiling carefully, tracing the water's path backward from where it appeared, trying to determine its origin point. Roof leaks rarely occurred directly above where water became visible. The moisture typically traveled along beams or stone surfaces before finding a way through. He explained this to Brother Anselm, nodding that the actual damage probably lay several feet away from the visible drip, somewhere along the roof slope where tiles had shifted or cracked. The repair would require accessing the roof itself, work that could not be done during rainfall but should be addressed soon to prevent further water damage. Brother Anselm nodded understanding, trusting Osric's expertise, and they agreed to examine the roof properly once the weather cleared. The afternoon advanced toward evening, rain continuing without pause, creating a day that felt suspended somehow, removed from normal progression. Osric returned to his workshop and completed his tool sharpening, then organized his store of wooden wedges and checked his supply of lime powder. The mundane tasks felt soothing, requiring attention without demanding intensity, allowing his mind to rest while his hands remained occupied. When the bells rang for vespers, he made his way to the church through rain that had diminished slightly, but still fell steadily. The service felt particularly intimate with rainfall providing constant accompaniment, the brothers' voices rising through the sound of water on stone, creating layered harmonies that seemed to acknowledge both human effort and nature's persistent presence. After prayers, Osric walked to his cottage through twilight obscured by clouds and rain. Inside, he built up his fire and prepared a simple supper, eating while watching flames dance in the hearth. The cottage felt especially cozy tonight, its stone walls holding warmth while rain spoke softly on the roof. He sat near the fire after eating, hands folded loosely in his lap, listening to the weather, grateful for shelter and safety. His work-weathered hands showed the day's evidence: apple juice stains that had darkened his skin, fresh calluses from turning the press's heavy screw, stone dust permanently embedded in creases and beneath fingernails. These marks told the story of his life more clearly than words ever could, each stain and callus representing hours of dedicated labor, years of faithful service to craft and community. Outside, rain continued falling through darkness, soaking into earth, filling cisterns and barrels, nourishing the valley's fields and forests. Inside, Osric prepared for sleep, banking his fire, removing his tunic, pulling the wool blanket over his shoulders. Through his window he could see nothing but darkness and the occasional glimmer where firelight reflected off falling rain. His breathing deepened, his body relaxed, and consciousness faded gently as rain continued its ancient song. Tomorrow the weather might clear, allowing him to examine the refectory's roof properly. Or the rain might continue, bringing different work, different rhythms. Either way, he would meet the day with the same patient attention he brought to everything, the same willingness to serve, the same deep contentment that had become inseparable from his very being. Sleep claimed him softly, and the rain fell on, steady and unhurried, asking nothing, simply being itself, simply doing what rain does, falling, soaking, nourishing, and then eventually ceasing, giving way to whatever weather chose to follow, part of the endless cycle that shaped the valley and all who lived within its sheltering embrace. Morning arrived with silence, the rain having ceased sometime during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. Osric woke to birdsong more vigorous than usual, as though the creatures were celebrating the storm's departure. He rose and opened his cottage door to find the air crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and stone, everything renewed by yesterday's soaking. After breaking his fast and tending his fire, he gathered the tools he would need for examining the refectory roof: a ladder, a leather satchel containing his smallest pry bar and several wooden wedges, and a coil of rope for safety. The morning sun had broken through the remaining clouds, and he could already feel warmth beginning to dry the dampness that clung to every surface. His boots left dark prints on the wet flagstones as he crossed the courtyard toward the refectory. Brother Anselm met him there, having recruited Brother Godfrey to help position the ladder and assist with whatever Osric might need. The young monk smiled in greeting, clearly pleased to participate in another skilled task alongside the stonemason. Together, they positioned the ladder against the refectory's eastern wall, extending it high enough to reach the roof's edge, securing its base with stones to prevent slipping on the still damp ground. Osric tested the ladder carefully before beginning his climb, his work-weathered hands gripping each rung firmly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. At the top, he pulled himself onto the roof's gentle slope, finding his footing on clay tiles that glistened with moisture. The view from this height showed the entire monastery complex spread below. The The church tower rising against the morning sky, the cloister garden with its geometric beds, the orchard beyond the walls, and the valley stretching away toward distant hills. He moved carefully across the roof's surface, testing each tile before placing full weight on it, searching for the source of yesterday's leak. The visible drip in the refectory's interior had appeared near the eastern corner, which meant the actual damage likely lay higher on the roof's slope, somewhere along the path water would naturally follow. His eyes scanned methodically, looking for displaced tiles, cracks, or gaps where moisture might penetrate. After several minutes of careful examination, he found the problem. 3 tiles in a row had shifted slightly, creating gaps between them through which water could enter. The displacement appeared recent, probably caused by the previous week's winds combined with yesterday's heavy rain. The repair would be straightforward, removing and resetting the tiles, ensuring proper overlap, perhaps replacing any that showed cracks. He called down to Brother Godfrey, explaining what he had found and what materials would be needed. The young monk hurried toward the workshop to gather replacement tiles from Osric's supply, along with a small amount of mortar for sealing. Brother Anselm remained at the ladder's base, watching carefully, ready to assist if needed. Osric settled himself on the roof to wait, sitting with his legs braced against the slope, enjoying the unexpected pleasure of this elevated perspective. From here, he could see Brother Thomas moving among the apple trees, checking for storm damage. In the herb garden, another figure, probably one of the novices, bent over the beds, gathering vegetables. The monastery's daily rhythm continued regardless of yesterday's weather, work resuming with the same patient attention that characterized every season. Brother Godfrey returned with the materials, climbing the ladder carefully while balancing the tiles and mortar pouch. Osric helped him onto the roof, and together they arranged everything within easy reach. The young monk asked whether he might watch the repair process, explaining that he found such work fascinating. The way skilled hands could diagnose problems and create lasting solutions. Osric agreed readily, pleased by the genuine interest. He began by carefully removing the displaced tiles, working his pry bar beneath each one, lifting gently to avoid cracking the clay. The tiles came free without resistance, revealing the wooden lath beneath, which showed some water staining but no rot. The leak had been caught early enough to prevent serious damage. Brother Godfrey observed closely, asking occasional questions about technique, about how Osric knew where to apply pressure, how he could tell whether tiles were salvageable or needed replacement. Osric answered patiently, explaining that tiles spoke their condition through subtle signs, cracks visible only in certain light, slight variations in color indicating weakness, the sound they made when tapped gently. The young monk listened intently, clearly trying to understand not just the mechanical process, but the deeper attention that guided it. This kind of teaching pleased Osric more than simple instruction in technique. Brother Godfrey was learning to see, to listen, to develop the sensitivity that separated adequate work from true craft. The resetting process required precision and patience. Each tile needed to overlap its neighbor by exactly the right amount, creating a surface that would shed water efficiently without creating gaps. Osric worked methodically, positioning and checking, adjusting and verifying, until each tile sat perfectly. He applied small amounts of mortar where tiles met the ridge line, sealing potential entry points while allowing the roof to breathe and flex with temperature changes. Brother Godfrey helped by passing tools and materials, his movements becoming more confident as he learned what Osric needed before being asked. The young monk's natural attentiveness and quick understanding suggested he might have aptitude for such work if ever he chose to learn it formally. Osric mentioned this observation, and Brother Godfrey flushed with pleasure, admitting that he had always loved working with his hands, finding satisfaction in creating tangible results. They completed the repair by mid-morning, the tiles reset and sealed, the roof once again weather-tight. Osric tested his work by pouring water from his drinking flask across the repaired section, watching carefully to ensure no moisture penetrated the joints. The water ran cleanly down the roof slope, following the intended path, and he nodded satisfaction. Brother Godfrey grinned, clearly pleased to have participated in successful work. Descending the ladder required the same care as climbing, perhaps more, since Osric's legs felt slightly unsteady after the prolonged roof work. He moved deliberately, testing each rung, keeping his center of gravity secure, and reached the ground safely. Brother Anselm expressed his gratitude, noting that the brothers could now eat their meals without dodging drips, and the three men shared a moment of quiet satisfaction before dispersing toward other tasks. Osric returned his ladder and tools to the workshop, then found himself at loose ends, no pressing repairs demanding immediate attention. The morning had grown genuinely warm, the sun burning away the last moisture from yesterday's rain, and he decided to walk beyond the monastery walls, perhaps visiting the quarry, simply enjoying the fine weather and the freedom of unscheduled time. The path wound through the beech grove, where leaves had begun showing autumn colors, yellows and golds mixing with the remaining green, creating a canopy that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds moved through the branches overhead, and somewhere a squirrel chattered territorial warnings. Osric walked slowly in no hurry, aware of his breathing, of his footfalls on the damp earth, of the way light shifted as branches swayed in the gentle breeze. At the quarry, he stood at the edge and looked down into the shallow excavation, seeing it with fresh eyes after several weeks' absence. New fracture lines had appeared in the exposed rock face, probably caused by winter's freezing and thawing, creating natural breaking points that would make future stone cutting easier. He descended carefully and examined these fractures, running his fingers along them, learning their character, adding this knowledge to his internal catalog of available materials. A family of rabbits had made their warren in one corner of the quarry, and he watched them for a time as they browsed on the sparse vegetation growing between stone fragments. The animals seemed untroubled by his presence, perhaps recognizing him from previous visits, understanding through some instinct that this particular human posed no threat. The largest rabbit, probably the mother, kept watch while the younger ones played, their movements quick and unpredictable, full of the energy that characterized all young creatures. Osric settled onto a sun-warmed boulder and simply sat, letting time pass without measuring it, present to the quarry's stark beauty, to the rabbit's companionship, to the warmth soaking into his shoulders through his tunic. His graying red hair lifted slightly in the breeze, and he closed his eyes, listening to the world's subtle sounds. Wind moving through grass, distant bird song, his own steady breathing, the quiet rustle of rabbits browsing. Eventually, he rose and climbed out of the quarry, continuing his walk along the hillside above the monastery. From this elevation, the entire valley spread before him, the fields and forests, the small stream that fed the monastery's well, the distant villages where smoke rose from cooking fires. He had lived his entire adult life in this valley, had never felt the need to venture beyond its boundaries, and from this vantage point, he could see why. Everything necessary for a good life existed within this sheltered space. The walk back took him through the orchard, where Brother Thomas knelt examining the base of one tree. The elderly monk looked up and gestured for Osric to join him. The storm had toppled a young apple tree, one of the saplings planted only 3 years prior, and Brother Thomas wondered whether it might be saved. The tree had not uprooted completely. Some roots remained anchored in soil, though the trunk now leaned at a severe angle. Osric examined the situation carefully, testing the trunk's stability, assessing the root damage, considering options. With proper staking and support, the tree might survive, might even resume vertical growth over several seasons. The work would require setting strong posts, using rope or cloth strips to hold the trunk upright without damaging bark, ensuring the remaining roots had firm contact with soil. Not difficult, but requiring care and patience. Brother Thomas looked hopeful as Osric explained this process. The tree came from particularly fine stock, its parent having produced the sweetest apples in the entire orchard, and he hated to lose its potential. If Osric thought the effort worthwhile, Brother Thomas would gladly help with whatever labor was required. They agreed to address the matter tomorrow morning, giving Osric time to prepare materials and plan the approach properly. The bells rang for sext, calling the community to midday prayer. Osric joined the brothers in the church, standing in his customary place, letting the Latin phrases wash over him like cool water. The service felt particularly peaceful today, perhaps because the storm's passage had left everything feeling renewed, cleansed, ready for whatever came next. After prayers came the midday meal, bread and cheese, with early autumn apples from the monastery's stores providing sweetness. Osric ate slowly, aware of flavors and textures, present to the simple abundance that sustained him. Around the refectory, brothers ate in companionable silence, and he felt himself part of this community, connected through shared purpose and mutual respect despite his solitary life beyond the walls. The afternoon stretched before him with no urgent demands, and Osric decided to spend it in quiet maintenance of his cottage. The rain had revealed several small gaps where mortar had weathered from between stones, nothing serious but worth addressing before winter arrived. He mixed a small batch of mortar and spent several hours working slowly around his cottage's exterior, filling gaps, smoothing joints, tending the structure that sheltered him with the same care he brought to the monastery's buildings. The work felt meditative, requiring attention without strain, allowing his mind to rest while his hands remained occupied. Sunlight warmed his back as he moved around the cottage, and occasionally he paused to observe the valley, to watch clouds drift across the sky, to simply exist in the moment without thought of past or future. His work-weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, and the familiar weight of the trowel felt comfortable in his grip, an extension of his body rather than a separate tool. By late afternoon, the cottage repairs sat complete, the small gaps filled and sealed, the structure sound and weather-tight. Osric cleaned his tools and put them away, then sat on the wooden stool outside his door, simply resting, watching shadows lengthen across the monastery grounds. The day had been good, productive without being hurried, peaceful without being empty, filled with the kind of simple satisfaction that required no justification beyond itself. Brother Anselm appeared carrying a basket, walking slowly along the path toward Osric's cottage. The elderly monk had brought fresh bread from the afternoon's baking, still warm, along with a small pot of honey and some late-season berries from the garden. He explained that the kitchen had produced extra today, and he thought Osric might appreciate the bounty. The stonemason accepted gratefully, genuinely moved by this thoughtfulness, by the way community expressed itself through such small acts of generosity. They sat together on the grass outside Osric's cottage, sharing the bread and honey, speaking little but comfortable in each other's presence. The sun declined toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and birds sang their evening songs from nearby trees. When the bread had been consumed, and the honey jar scraped nearly clean, Brother Anselm rose with some effort and bid Osric farewell, walking back toward the monastery as twilight gathered. Osric remained outside, watching daylight fade, listening to the valley's evening sounds. The bells rang for vespers, their tones carrying clearly through the still air, and he knew he should walk to the church, should join the brothers in their closing prayers. But something held him here, not reluctance exactly, but a sense that perhaps tonight, sitting outside his cottage as darkness settled, constituted its own form of prayer, its own acknowledgement of something larger than himself. He sat until stars began appearing in the darkening sky, until the air grew cold enough that he needed his cottage's warmth. Inside, he built up his fire and sat near its light, hands folded loosely, mind quiet, heart full of gratitude for the day that had passed, for the life he had built, for the continuing opportunity to serve and work and be part of something lasting and good. Sleep came easily when he finally sought it, his body tired in the pleasant way that followed useful labor, his mind peaceful, untroubled by worry or regret. Tomorrow would bring the work of saving Brother Thomas's fallen tree, and after that, other tasks would present themselves, an endless succession of needs that asked only for his patient attention and willing hands. Beneath his wool blanket, Osric's breathing deepened and slowed, and consciousness faded gently into darkness that held no fear, only rest, only the promise of another day, another opportunity to tend the stones and serve the community and move through the world with the same unhurried grace that had defined his entire life. Morning came with birdsong and pale sunlight filtering through thin clouds. Osric woke feeling rested, his body ready for the work ahead with Brother Thomas's fallen tree. He dressed and ate his simple breakfast, then gathered the materials he would need. 2 sturdy oak posts he had cut and stored months earlier for just such purposes, coils of hemp rope, strips of soft cloth to protect bark, his heaviest mallet for driving posts into earth. Brother Thomas waited in the orchard when Osric arrived, the elderly monk standing beside the toppled sapling with an expression of concern mixed with hope. The young tree had survived the night without further damage, its leaves still green despite the trunk's awkward angle. Together, they examined the situation more closely in full daylight, and Osric felt encouraged. More roots remained anchored than he had initially observed, and the trunk showed no signs of cracking or splitting. He explained his plan to Brother Thomas. They would drive the two posts into the ground on either side of the tree, creating stable anchors. Then they would carefully lift the trunk back toward vertical, using the rope to hold it in position against the posts, wrapping cloth around contact points to prevent bark damage. The tree would need to remain supported for at least 2 growing seasons, perhaps 3, until its roots could establish sufficient strength to hold it upright independently. Brother Thomas nodded understanding and set to work helping Osric position the first post. They selected a spot perhaps 2 feet from the trunk, far enough to avoid damaging remaining roots but close enough to provide effective support. Osric drove the post into the earth with his mallet, the impacts creating a steady rhythm that echoed across the orchard. The soil, still soft from recent rain, accepted the post more easily than it would have during dry weather, and soon the first anchor stood firmly embedded, rising perhaps 4 feet above ground level. The second post went in on the opposite side, positioned to balance the support and prevent the tree from leaning in a different direction once raised. With both anchors secure, Osric prepared the cloth strips, wrapping them around the trunk at 2 points where rope would make contact. Brother Thomas watched this careful preparation with evident approval, recognizing the attention being paid to protecting the young tree from any additional harm. The actual lifting required coordination and gentleness. Osric took hold of the trunk near its base, while Brother Thomas supported it higher up, and together they raised it slowly, feeling for resistance, pausing when roots pulled too tightly, allowing time for soil to resettle around root fibers. The tree yielded gradually to their patient effort, rising degree by degree until it stood nearly vertical, held in place by their combined strength. Brother Godfrey appeared as they worked, having seen them from across the orchard and come to offer assistance. His timing proved fortunate. Osric directed him to hold the trunk steady while he and Brother Thomas secured the rope supports. They worked methodically, tying rope from trunk to post on one side, then the other, adjusting tension carefully until the tree stood straight and stable, no longer requiring human hands to maintain its position. Osric tested the installation by releasing his hold and stepping back, watching carefully for any shifting or settling. The tree stood firm, its trunk vertical, its leaves catching morning light, already looking more natural in this restored position. He showed Brother Thomas and Brother Godfrey how to check the rope tension periodically, how to adjust if needed, how to watch for signs of bark damage that would require adding more protective cloth. Brother Thomas expressed his gratitude warmly, his aged hands resting briefly on Osric's shoulder in a gesture that conveyed more than words could. The young monk's relief was equally evident, and even Brother Godfrey seemed pleased to have participated in saving something living, in giving this young tree another chance to fulfill its purpose in the orchard. The 3 men stood together for a moment, simply observing their work, before dispersing toward other morning tasks. Osric returned to his workshop to clean and store his tools. The morning had advanced toward midday, and he found himself considering what to do with the afternoon hours. Brother Cyprian had mentioned in passing, perhaps a week ago, that several threshold stones in the library showed signs of wear, their surfaces becoming uneven from countless footfalls. Not urgent repairs, but the kind of gradual maintenance that prevented small problems from becoming larger ones. He decided to assess those thresholds after the midday meal, perhaps beginning work on any that needed immediate attention. The task would take him through several days, working on 1 or 2 thresholds each afternoon, but there was satisfaction in such systematic maintenance, intending every part of the monastery with equal care regardless of how visible or dramatic the work might be. The bells rang for sext, calling the community to prayer. Osric made his way to the church, where sunlight now streamed through the high windows, creating pools of golden light on the worn flagstones. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythm, the brothers' voices rising in harmonies that had been refined over generations of repetition. He stood in his customary place, eyes half closed, breathing in time with the chanting, feeling himself part of something much larger than his individual existence. After prayers came the midday meal, a hearty pottage of lentils and leeks, accompanied by fresh bread and a small portion of the previous day's pressed cider, its sweetness already beginning the transformation toward tartness that would deepen over winter. Osric ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of the nourishment flowing into his body, grateful for food that sustained both life and work. Brother Cyprian found him as he departed the refectory, the librarian mentioning that he had noticed Osric examining the church columns the other day, and wondered whether the stonemason ever felt pride in his work, in the repairs that had served so faithfully over the years. Osric considered this question carefully before answering. Pride seemed too strong a word. He said finally, perhaps satisfaction better described what he felt. This quiet pleasure in work completed well, in craft deployed faithfully in service of something meant to endure. The librarian nodded thoughtfully, understanding the distinction, and mentioned that such satisfaction seemed rare in the world beyond monastery walls, where work often served only immediate need or personal gain rather than lasting purpose. They walked together toward the library, speaking little but comfortable in their companionship, 2 men who had devoted their lives to careful tending, one of manuscripts, the other of stone, understanding each other through this shared dedication. Inside the library, Osric examined the threshold stones Brother Cyprian had mentioned. 3 showed noticeable wear, their centers worn slightly hollow from the concentration of foot traffic, creating surfaces that might eventually cause stumbling if left unaddressed. The repair would require grinding down the raised edges to match the worn centers, creating smooth transitions that felt natural underfoot. Painstaking work, but necessary for maintaining the library's safety and functionality. He decided to begin with the threshold that showed the most wear, the stone at the library's main entrance. Brother Cyprian returned to his manuscript work, while Osric fetched his grinding stone and water bucket from the workshop. The grinding process created a distinctive sound, stone on stone, wet and rhythmic, and Brother Hugh looked up from his copying to watch for a moment before returning to his own meticulous labor. Osric knelt and began working the grinding stone across the threshold surface, using circular motions, checking frequently with his fingers to assess progress. The work demanded patience more than strength, gradual removal of material rather than aggressive shaping, and he settled into its meditative rhythm easily. Water splashed onto the stone, carrying away the ground material, and he paused periodically to examine the surface, verifying that he was creating the smooth, level transition he sought. The afternoon passed in this quiet labor. Sunlight moved across the library floor, marking time's passage without urgency, and the only sounds were the grinding stone's rasp, Brother Hugh's quill scratching on vellum, and the occasional rustle of pages being turned. Osric's work-weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, guided by decades of experience, requiring almost no conscious direction. His graying red hair caught the light when he leaned back to check his progress, and sweat dampened his tunic despite the library's coolness. By the time the threshold satisfied his critical examination, smooth, level, safe underfoot, the afternoon had advanced toward evening. Osric cleaned the stone carefully, wiping away all traces of ground material and water, leaving the surface ready for immediate use. Brother Cyprian came to inspect the completed work, running his foot across the threshold, noting how it now felt seamless rather than uneven. He expressed his appreciation simply, mentioning that such careful maintenance preserved not just the stones themselves, but the sense of order and safety that allowed the brothers to focus on their spiritual work without distraction. Osric gathered his tools and departed, stepping outside to find the day declining toward dusk. The air had cooled pleasantly, and long shadows stretched across the monastery grounds. He walked to the fountain to wash, scrubbing stone dust from his hands and arms, splashing water on his face. The coolness felt refreshing, and he stood for a moment with water dripping from his beard, simply present to the ending day. Brother Anselm appeared from the herb garden, carrying his basket of evening harvests, sage and thyme, a few late carrots, some parsley that would grace tomorrow's pottage. The elderly monk paused beside Osric, and they stood together watching the light change, the way ordinary stone seemed to glow as sunset approached. After a while, Brother Anselm mentioned that winter would arrive soon, bringing its own rhythm of work, indoor repairs during the coldest months, preparation of materials for spring, the slower pace that cold weather imposed on outdoor labor. Osric agreed, already thinking ahead to winter tasks, to the satisfaction of working by firelight in his workshop, to the different quality that seasonal change brought to familiar work. They parted as the bells began ringing for vespers, Brother Anselm heading toward the kitchen with his harvest, while Osric made his way to the church for evening prayer. The service gathered the day toward its close with familiar prayers and chanted psalms. The church had grown dim, lit primarily by candles whose flames created dancing shadows on the carved columns. Osric stood in his customary place, his tired body grateful for stillness, his mind quiet, his heart full of the simple contentment that had become inseparable from his daily existence. When the final blessing had been spoken, he remained seated briefly, reluctant to break the peaceful spell. Outside, twilight had deepened into early night, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. He walked slowly toward his cottage, aware of each footfall, present to the cooling air against his face, grateful for the day that had passed. Inside, he built up his fire and prepared a simple supper, eating while watching flames dance on stone walls, the lavender scent drifting down from the rafters to mingle with wood smoke, and the lingering smell of stone dust on his hands. After his meal, he sat with no particular task, simply present to the evening's quietness. Through his window, he could see the monastery walls and beyond them the valley fading into darkness. Somewhere an owl called, its voice lonely and beautiful, and he listened to that distant cry with a sense of kinship, recognizing something of his own solitary contentment in the bird's patient hunting. Osric, 63 years old, prepared for sleep as the fire burned low. Beneath his wool blanket, his breathing deepened and slowed, his body releasing the day's efforts, his mind drifting toward rest. Tomorrow would bring more threshold repairs, and after that, other work would present itself. The endless succession of tasks that asked only for his patient attention and willing hands, that gave shape and meaning to his days, that connected him to something larger and more enduring than his individual life. Sleep came gently, consciousness fading like embers dimming, and his last awareness was gratitude for work completed faithfully, for community that valued his presence, for the continuing opportunity to serve and tend and move through the world with unhurried grace, offering what he had to offer, asking nothing more than the chance to continue doing so for as long as his strength and vision lasted. Morning arrived with mist curling through the valley, soft and white, wrapping the monastery in gentle obscurity. Osric woke to this quietness and lay still for a moment, breathing deeply, aware of his body's familiar weight beneath the wool blanket, aware of the lavender scent drifting down from the rafters, aware of another day beginning with its patient invitation to work and presence. He rose and dressed, stirring the banked coals in his hearth until flames revived, their warmth pushing back the morning chill. After breaking his fast with bread and ale, he stood at his cottage door and looked out at the mist-shrouded grounds, everything softened and made mysterious by the white vapor that moved slowly across the courtyard like something alive and purposeful. The bells rang for lauds, their sound muffled by the mist, and he made his way through the obscurity toward the church, following paths his feet knew without needing to see them clearly. Other brothers moved through the white stillness, their forms appearing and disappearing like spirits, and he felt himself part of this procession, this daily gathering that had repeated itself for generations and would continue long after he had ceased his walking. The service proceeded with its familiar rhythm, voices rising through the mist-dampened air, creating harmonies that seemed to hang suspended in the church's coolness. Osric stood in his customary place, eyes closed, breathing in time with the chanting, feeling the deep contentment that had become his constant companion. When the prayers concluded, he remained for a moment, reluctant to leave this space of gathered quietness. Outside, the mist had begun to thin, sunlight starting to penetrate the white curtain, promising a clear day ahead. Osric walked to his workshop and gathered his grinding stone and water bucket, ready to continue the threshold work he had begun yesterday. The library awaited, its remaining worn thresholds needing the same patient attention he had given to the first. Brother Cyprian greeted him at the library door, mentioning that he had walked across yesterday's repaired threshold multiple times that morning, each crossing a small pleasure, appreciating how something so simple, a level surface underfoot, could contribute to the sense of order and peace that allowed contemplative work to flourish. Osric nodded, understanding this connection between physical maintenance and spiritual practice, between tending stone and tending the soul. He knelt at the second threshold and began his grinding work, the familiar motion establishing its rhythm, the sound of stone on stone creating its own meditation. Through the library windows, he could see the mist continuing to dissipate, revealing the herb garden where Brother Anselm moved among his plants, the orchard where the rescued sapling stood supported by its oak posts, the distant valley beginning to emerge from its white covering. Time passed without urgency. Brother Hugh worked at his manuscript copying, his quill moving steadily across vellum, creating beauty through patient repetition of careful strokes. Osric ground stone slowly, removing material grain by grain, checking progress with his sensitive fingers, seeking the smooth transition that would serve the library's users without their conscious awareness. Both men practiced their crafts in companionable silence, understanding each other through their shared dedication to work done properly, completely, faithfully. By mid-morning, the second threshold sat complete, smooth, level, safe. Osric cleaned it carefully and moved to the third, the final threshold that required attention. This one showed less wear than the others, needing perhaps half the work, and he estimated he would finish before the midday meal. The sun had fully emerged now, streaming through the windows, warming the library's interior, and he worked in this golden light, feeling it soak into his shoulders, grateful for its presence. Brother Thomas appeared as Osric completed the final threshold, the elderly monk mentioning that he had checked the rescued sapling that morning and found it standing firm, its leaves already seeming to lift with renewed vigor. He wanted Osric to know how much that care meant to him, how satisfying it felt to see something young and vulnerable given another chance through skill and patience. Osric received this gratitude simply, deflecting attention as always, but feeling warmed nonetheless by the recognition. The bells rang for sext, calling the community to midday prayer. Osric cleaned his tools and joined the brothers in the church, where the service proceeded with its timeless rhythm. After prayers came the midday meal, bread and cheese, autumn apples, and pottage fragrant with herbs from Brother Anselm's garden. He ate slowly, aware of flavors and textures, grateful for nourishment that sustained both body and spirit. The afternoon stretched before him with no urgent tasks demanding attention. He decided to walk the monastery's perimeter one final time, checking the walls he had tended for 40 years, simply observing, simply being present to this place that had become his entire world. The walk took him past the church, the chapter house, the garden shed with its newly repaired foundation, the refectory with its sealed roof, the scriptorium with its smoothed window seat. Everywhere he looked, his work showed itself, in joints freshly mortared, in stones reset and leveled, in surfaces ground smooth for safety and beauty. Yet the work remained largely invisible, noticed only in its absence, when something broke or shifted or wore unevenly. This invisibility pleased him, this evidence that craft served purpose beyond recognition or praise, that tending mattered regardless of whether anyone observed the tending. He completed his circuit and found himself standing in the orchard, near the rescued sapling that stood supported by its oak posts. The young tree's leaves rustled gently in the afternoon breeze, and Osric reached out to touch its trunk carefully, feeling life continuing within the bark, feeling the patient determination of growing things to survive and flourish despite setbacks and storms. Brother Godfrey approached, the young monk smiling in greeting, mentioning that he had been thinking about their conversation on the roof, about learning to see and listen, about developing the sensitivity that separated adequate work from true craft. He wondered whether Osric might be willing to teach him more, to let him assist with repairs occasionally, to share the knowledge accumulated over decades of faithful practice. Osric felt something warm expand in his chest at this request. He agreed readily, recognizing in Brother Godfrey the same genuine interest, the same careful attention that had characterized his own early apprenticeship so many years ago. Perhaps this was another form of tending, passing knowledge forward, ensuring that craft would continue beyond his own hands, that the monastery's stones would receive care long after he had ceased his work. They walked together toward the workshop, speaking of small things, tools and their proper maintenance, the characteristics of different stones, the importance of patience in work that would outlast individual lives. Brother Godfrey listened with evident hunger for this knowledge, and Osric found himself enjoying the teaching, the opportunity to articulate understandings that had lived mostly in his hands rather than his words. The afternoon advanced toward evening, shadows lengthening across the courtyard. Osric showed Brother Godfrey how to sharpen chisels properly, how to test edges, how to recognize when a tool had reached the end of its useful life and needed replacement rather than continued maintenance. The young monk's hands proved capable, his attention unwavering, and Osric felt confident that this knowledge would be preserved, would continue serving the monastery's needs long after his own work had ended. When the bells rang for vespers, they walked together to the church, master and student, old man and young, both carrying knowledge forward through time, both part of the endless succession of hands that had tended these stones since their first placement. The service gathered them into community, voices rising in familiar harmonies, prayers spoken in the same words that generations had used to mark days ending. After the service, Osric walked to his cottage through twilight that carried the first real cold of approaching winter. Inside, he built up his fire and prepared his evening meal, eating slowly, watching flames dance on stone walls. Through his window, stars emerged in the darkening sky, brilliant and distant, their light reaching across space to touch his small corner of the world. He sat near the fire after eating, his work-weathered hands resting on his knees, examining them in the flickering light. These hands had placed thousands of stones, had mixed countless batches of mortar, had shaped and smoothed and leveled more surfaces than he could possibly count. They showed every year of his craft, every season of his dedication, and he felt proud of them, grateful for their continuing strength and steadiness. Osric, 63 years old, prepared for sleep as the fire burned down to glowing coals. Tomorrow would bring new work, or perhaps rest, or perhaps the opportunity to teach Brother Godfrey more about the craft they both now shared. Whatever came, he would meet it with the same patient attention, the same deep contentment that had shaped his entire life. Beneath his wool blanket, His breathing deepened and slowed. Through the window, moonlight painted silver patterns on the floor, and the lavender scent drifted down from the rafters, sweet and familiar. His last conscious thought was gratitude, for work completed faithfully, for knowledge passed forward, for community and solitude both, for stones that waited patiently for care, and for days that unfolded with reliable rhythm. Sleep claimed him softly, and outside his cottage the monastery stood solid against the night, its walls strong, its stones secure, tended by hands that had learned to see beyond surface to structure, to understand that the best work often went unnoticed. That craft showed itself most clearly in what didn't break, in what continued serving quietly and faithfully year after year, season after season, asking nothing, offering everything, shelter and safety, beauty and peace. The patient endurance of things built well and tended carefully, lasting through time's passage like stars continuing their ancient paths across the darkness, constant and sure, beautiful in their simple, faithful presence.